Somewhere beneath the Coral Sea, roughly 500 miles off the eastern coast of Australia, resting on the ocean floor at a depth of nearly 2 miles, lies the wreck of an aircraft carrier. She has been down there since the 8th of May, 1942. Her aircraft, some still with folded wings, sit undisturbed in the silent dark. Her flight deck, once alive with the thunder of engines and the voices of 2,000 men, is now covered in the kind of stillness only the deep ocean can offer. For more than 75 years, no human eye saw her. She was simply gone, a name on a list of losses, a grief that the Navy carried quietly. She was USS Lexington. The sailors who served on her called her Lady Lex. And this, all of it, the battle, the loss, the strange and improbable victory it contained, began not with a declaration of war, not with a fleet in formation, but with a Japanese plan so ambitious it could have reshaped the entire Pacific War in a single stroke, a plan called Operation Mo, a plan that most Americans had never heard of and that the Imperial Japanese Navy believed was unstoppable. This documentary is about the 5 days in May of 1942 when the United States Navy sailed directly into that plan. It is about the two great carriers, Lexington and USS Yorktown, that carried the weight of an entire war on their flight decks. It is about the admirals who made decisions with incomplete information and too little time. It is about the aircrews who flew into the unknown, often without knowing if there would be a ship to come back to. And it is about a battle that, by the strict arithmetic of ships lost and ships saved, the Americans lost yet one whose consequences would help save Australia and turn the tide of the Pacific War. If you are watching this tonight, getting comfortable, letting the weight of the day ease away, welcome. This is a long story, told slowly and told right. There is no need to rush. The Coral Sea has waited 80 years. It can wait a little longer while we tell it properly. Stay with us. Because the story of America's first carrier strike is one of the most extraordinary chapters in naval history, and it begins, as so many great stories do, not with triumph, but with catastrophe. If you are enjoying this documentary series, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. Your support is what keeps this channel going. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. A World Remade the Pacific Before the Coral Sea. In the spring of 1942, the Pacific Ocean was no longer what it had been 6 months earlier. In the space of roughly 150 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy had struck Pearl Harbor, seized the Philippines, swept through Malaya, captured Singapore, driven through the Dutch East Indies, and pushed its forces to the doorstep of Burma, all while the watching world struggled to find words adequate for what was happening. The speed was not just military, it was psychological. The certainty that had anchored Western power in Asia for a century had been dismantled, not gradually, but almost overnight. What replaced it was something colder and harder to name, the recognition that the war in the Pacific was going to be fundamentally different from anything that had come before. The United States Navy entered this new world off balance and under strength. The battleships that had represented the symbolic spine of American sea power were sitting in the mud of Pearl Harbor, some of them still smoking. What remained intact, what had, almost by accident, survived the 7th of December because they happened to be at sea, were the carriers. USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, USS Lexington, USS Yorktown. These were not the capital ships that pre-war doctrine had imagined would win the great fleet engagements. They were, in the minds of many senior admirals, supporting vessels, platforms for reconnaissance and screening, useful but secondary. The battleship was supposed to be the queen of the ocean. The carrier was supposed to be her handmaid. Pearl Harbor changed that equation in a single morning. Not because it proved carriers were superior, it actually proved the opposite. At first, since it was Japanese carrier aircraft that had done the damage, but because it left carriers as the only credible offensive force the United States possessed in the Pacific. There was no choice. The carriers would have to carry the war. They would have to learn under fire and in real time how to do something the Navy had never really done before: fight a modern carrier war against an enemy who had been practicing and refining that art for years. The margin for error was almost nothing. The consequences of failure were total. Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet in the final days of December 1941, understood this with a clarity that was almost painful. He had no battleships to send into battle. He had 4 carriers, and one of them, Saratoga, had already been torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in January of 1942 and was undergoing repairs on the American west coast. He had 3 carriers, 3 ships that stood between the United States and complete naval impotence in the largest ocean on Earth. Every decision Nimitz made in those early months was made in the shadow of that arithmetic, the knowledge that losing even one of those carriers could be catastrophic, and that not using them at all meant ceding the Pacific without a fight. The Japanese, for their part, were operating from a position of strength, but that strength carried its own peculiar kind of pressure. The architects of Japan's Pacific strategy understood that the window of Japanese advantage was not permanent. American industrial capacity was already beginning to stir. The shipyards of the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico were laying keels for ships that would eventually dwarf anything Japan could produce. The strategy, such as it was, required Japan to expand its defensive perimeter so far and so fast that America would calculate the cost of fighting back to be prohibitive and agree to a negotiated settlement. Every month that passed without that settlement narrowed Japan's options. The momentum that had seemed irresistible had to keep moving, or it would stall, and if it stalled, the entire logic of the Pacific War began to unravel. It was in this context of American weakness and Japanese urgency that the Coral Sea became significant. Port Moresby, on the southern coast of New Guinea, was the key. From Port Moresby, Japanese land-based aircraft could range over the Torres Strait and threaten the Australian mainland directly. Its capture would sever the sea routes connecting the United States to Australia. It would place Japan on Australia's northern doorstep and, in the thinking of Japanese planners, effectively neutralize the continent as a base for any future Allied counteroffensive. The operation to take it, Operation Mo, was not merely an act of conquest. It was the logical next step in a strategy designed to end the war before America could rebuild its strength. The Coral Sea, that warm, island-dotted body of water, bounded by Australia to the west, the Solomon Islands to the east, and New Guinea to the north, was about to become the arena where 2 very different ideas about naval power and 2 very different ideas about how this war was going to end would meet for the first time. Neither side knew exactly what the other possessed. Neither side knew exactly what the other planned. What both sides knew, and what every naval officer on both sides understood in their bones, was that what happened in that sea in the first week of May 1942 was going to matter enormously. They were right about that much. The carriers were already moving. The men on board them did not yet know what was waiting. The Pacific War was about to enter a new phase, one fought not by guns pointing at each other across a visible horizon, but by aircraft launched from ships that never came within sight of their enemies, striking at ranges that redefined what battle even meant. This was the age of the carrier, and it was being born, messily and at enormous cost, in the waters of the Coral Sea. Before we can understand the battle, we have to understand the machines and the men who fought it, the ships that carried them, and the long, strange roads that brought them all to the same place at the same time in May of 1942. The story of the Coral Sea is also the story of 2 ships, Lady Lex and the Yorktown. One of them would never come home, and the other would be asked to go back to sea after 3 days of repairs and fight the most important naval battle of the war. We will get to both of those stories, but first we need to go back further. Back to the 1920s, to the treaty rooms and the shipyards, to the beginning of the age that made everything in the Coral Sea possible. This is where it starts. Chapter 2. Steel becomes a carrier, the birth of Lexington and Yorktown. In the early 1920s, the world's great naval powers were building warships at a pace that was beginning to frighten their own treasuries. The First World War had ended with the battleship still the undisputed measure of a nation's naval ambition, and every major power, Britain, Japan, the United States, was drawing up plans for ever larger, ever more heavily armed capital ships. The race had its own momentum, its own logic. No nation could afford to let a rival build more battleships without answering in kind. The result was a spiral that seemed to have no natural ceiling, only the limit of national wealth, and in the exhausted economies of the early 20s, that limit was being approached fast. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was the world's attempt to stop the spiral before it destroyed what the First World War had left. The major naval powers agreed to caps on total tonnage, limits on individual ship size, and ratios governing who could build how much of what. It was an imperfect agreement, full of compromises and loopholes that would generate controversy for 2 decades. But it contained one provision that would, entirely, unintentionally, change the history of naval warfare. The treaty permitted the United States and Japan to convert 2 large incomplete hulls, each originally intended as battle cruisers, into aircraft carriers, even if those converted ships exceeded the standard carrier tonnage limit. For the United States Navy, those 2 hulls became USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. They were enormous ships by the standards of the time, each displacing more than 33,000 tons, each carrying a flight deck over 800 feet long. USS Lexington was commissioned on the 14th of December, 1927, at Quincy, Massachusetts, with Captain Albert W. Marshall in command. She had been laid down as a battle cruiser, a fast, powerful, lightly armored ship designed to outrun what it could not outfight. In her new form, she retained that speed, that long hull, that sense of barely contained kinetic energy. She could make 33 knots fast enough to chase almost anything in the fleet. But speed was only part of what made her remarkable. What she carried in her hangars, what she could put in the sky, was the real measure of her significance. In the late 1920s and through the 1930s, naval aviation was still working out what it was capable of. The aircraft themselves were changing rapidly, fabric-covered biplanes giving way to all-metal monoplanes, open cockpits giving way to enclosed ones, ranges extending, payloads growing, dive bombing and torpedo delivery techniques being refined through exercises and war games. Lexington and Saratoga were the laboratories where a great deal of this work happened. Their size allowed them to carry large air groups. Their speed allowed them to range widely. Their crews developed the doctrine, the procedure, the muscle memory that would eventually produce the aviators who fought at Coral Sea. USS Yorktown CV-5, in the Navy's hull classification, was a different kind of ship. She was not a conversion. She was built from the keel up as a carrier, laid down in 1934 and commissioned in September of 1937. Where Lexington was vast and somewhat ungainly, a repurposed giant adapted to a new role, Yorktown was purpose-built, refined, modern. Her design incorporated the lessons that Lexington and Saratoga had taught, lessons about flight deck layout, about hangar arrangement, about damage control, about how to operate a large air group efficiently in combat conditions. She was 20,000 tons lighter than Lexington, which made her more economical but also less spacious. What she lost in size, she gained in efficiency, and arguably, in the quality of her design as a fighting instrument. The men who served on these ships in the years between the wars developed something that is hard to quantify, but easy to recognize in the historical record: a collective expertise, a shared body of knowledge about carrier operations that was built slowly, year after year, through exercises off Hawaii and in the Caribbean, through war games that tested and refined doctrine, through the kind of accumulated experience that only time and repetition can provide. They developed procedures for launching and recovering aircraft at high speed. They learned how to coordinate strikes from multiple carriers. They worked out, through painful trial and error, the best way to defend a carrier against air attack, which was, fundamentally, to put your own fighters in the sky before the enemy's attack arrived, and to have your escort ships ready with anti-aircraft fire when the fighters were not enough. None of this was perfect. Much of it would prove inadequate under actual combat conditions, but it was a foundation, and it was better than nothing. By the time Japan struck Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, Lexington had been in commission for 14 years. She was not a young ship, but she was an experienced one. On the morning of the attack, she was at sea, not at Pearl, not caught in the harbour transporting aircraft to Midway Island as part of a reinforcement effort. She launched search aircraft when the news came in, joined up with other task forces to hunt for the Japanese fleet, and then returned to Pearl Harbor nearly a week later, moving through the harbour with its sickening evidence of what had happened. Yorktown, meanwhile, was in the Atlantic. She had spent much of 1941 escorting convoys in a war that America was not yet officially fighting, and would be transferred to the Pacific Fleet in late December, arriving at Pearl Harbor to begin the kind of carrier war that her designers had imagined but never quite planned for. The ships were ready as they could be. The question, the one that hung over everything in those early desperate months of 1942, was whether the men, the doctrine, and the luck would be equal to what was coming. Because what was coming, moving south through the Pacific with the deliberate confidence of a force that had not yet been seriously challenged, was the combined striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and at its core, the carrier force that had devastated Pearl Harbor. The same pilots, the same aircraft, the same admirals. They were coming south now, and Lexington and Yorktown were the only answer America had. Chapter 3. The Rising Tide, Japan's March South and Operation Mo. By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had accomplished something that no naval force in modern history had managed. It had seized control of a maritime theatre, roughly the size of the continental United States, in less than 5 months. The catalogue of conquests reads like a list assembled by a cartographer who had decided to redraw the map of Asia from scratch. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, Wake Island, Guam, thousands of miles of coastline, dozens of island chains, oil fields and rubber plantations and naval bases, all of it absorbed into the Japanese sphere, with a speed that left the Allied powers scrambling simply to understand what had happened, let alone respond to it. At the strategic center of this expansion was a concept the Japanese called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vast self-sufficient economic and military bloc bounded by a defensive perimeter of island bases that would make Japan invulnerable to the kind of economic strangulation that Tokyo had always feared from Western powers. The perimeter had to be wide enough to absorb the inevitable Allied counteroffensive. It had to include enough natural resources, oil, rubber, iron to sustain a long war. And it had to be established so quickly, so completely, that America and Britain would recognize the futility of fighting back and agree to terms. That was the theory. The practice was more complicated because the further Japan pushed, the more exposed its supply lines became, and the more vulnerable its outer perimeter was to the kind of concentrated Allied counterattack that the perimeter was supposed to prevent. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood this tension better than most. He had spent time in the United States, he had studied at Harvard, observed American industry at close hand, and he harbored few illusions about Japan's long-term prospects in a prolonged war against American industrial capacity. His strategic calculation was stark. Japan had to force a decisive battle against the American carrier fleet before the United States could rebuild and expand its naval power. Every operation, every strategic move had to be evaluated against that primary objective. Port Moresby mattered not just because of what it would do for Japan's strategic position in the South Pacific, though it mattered enormously for that, but because its capture might draw out the American carriers in a defensive response, giving Yamamoto the engagement he needed. Operation Mo was the name given to the plan to take Port Moresby and establish a seaplane base at Tulagi in the Lower Solomon Islands. The plan was intricate and multi-pronged, as Japanese operational planning often was, relying on coordinated movements by multiple task forces over a wide area. One task force would invade Tulagi. A second would establish a seaplane base to extend reconnaissance coverage. A third, the invasion force itself, with transports carrying troops, would round the tip of New Guinea through the Jomard Passage and land near Port Moresby. A light carrier, Shōkaku, with heavy cruisers, would provide close cover for the invasion convoy. And the real striking force, two of Japan's best fleet carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, would operate separately, positioned to destroy any Allied naval forces that tried to interfere. The logic was sound on paper. Shōkaku and Zuikaku together represented a formidable concentration of air power. Between them, they could put roughly 120 aircraft in the sky. Their air groups had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with devastating precision. Their crews were experienced, aggressive, and confident. Against what the Americans were likely to send at most two carriers, probably fewer, the Japanese carrier force should have had a decisive advantage in numbers and experience. What the planners in Tokyo did not fully account for was the degree to which American signals intelligence had penetrated Japanese communications. The American codebreakers working out of a basement office at Pearl Harbor in conditions of almost surreal secrecy had been reading Japanese naval traffic with increasing proficiency. They could not decode every message. They could not reconstruct Japanese plans with perfect fidelity. But by April of 1942, they had assembled enough fragments, enough cross-reference traffic, to give Admiral Nimitz a general picture of what was coming. They knew about Operation Mo. They knew Port Moresby was the target. They knew roughly when the invasion force would move. What they did not know with certainty was the exact composition of the Japanese striking force, or the precise timing and routing of every element of the plan, but the essential warning was there. Nimitz could not ignore it. The decision Nimitz faced was one of the most consequential of his career. He had two carriers available, Lexington and Yorktown, that he could send to the Coral Sea to confront the Japanese operation. This meant committing more than half of his total carrier strength to a battle in which the Japanese were expected to have a significant numerical advantage. If both carriers were lost, the Pacific Fleet would be almost entirely without offensive capability. If the carriers stayed home and Port Moresby fell, Australia's position would become desperate, and the Allied foothold in the South Pacific would be gravely weakened. There was no safe option. There was only the choice between action with its risks and inaction with its own, more certain catastrophe. Nimitz chose to fight. He sent Lexington under the command of Task Force 11 and Yorktown at the center of Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, south and west toward the Coral Sea. They moved with the knowledge that the Japanese were coming and with the hope, not the certainty, that the intelligence picture was accurate enough to let them intercept the invasion force before it reached Port Moresby. The carriers moved through waters that had never seen anything like them, toward a battle that had never happened before in the entire history of naval warfare, carrying with them the weight of a cause that stretched from the harbours of Pearl Harbor to the cities of the Australian continent. Operation Mo was in motion, and for the first time something was in motion to stop it. Chapter 4. The Commanders, Fletcher, Fitch, and the Men Who Led. Wars are shaped by institutions, by technology, by the vast impersonal forces of industrial production and geography. But in the specific, granular texture of a single engagement, what matters most is people. The Coral Sea battle was commanded on the American side by two admirals whose names are less famous than the battle they fought, and whose decisions made under pressure, with bad information, under fire, determined everything that followed. To understand what happened in the Coral Sea, you have to understand the men who made the choices. And to understand those men, you have to understand something about the peculiar culture of the United States Navy in the years before the war. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded Task Force 17, built around Yorktown. He was not, by any straightforward measure, a naval aviator. His background was in surface warfare destroyers and cruisers, and he had come to carrier command late, at a point in his career when many of his contemporaries in the aviator community felt that carrier task forces should be led by men who had grown up in naval aviation, who understood its rhythms and its demands from the inside. The criticism of Fletcher, some of it contemporary, much of it retrospective, was that he was too cautious, too inclined to conserve his forces, too quick to worry about fuel and logistics when he should have been pressing his attacks. There is truth in this. Fletcher made decisions at Coral Sea and later at Midway that his critics found baffling. But the criticism often underestimates the weight of what he was carrying. He was responsible for ships that could not be replaced, not quickly, not easily, and every decision he made was shadowed by that responsibility. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch had a different profile. He was a qualified aviator, one of the Navy's early naval aviator designees, and he commanded the carrier Lexington and her task force with a more aggressive instinct than Fletcher's. On the 8th of May, 1942, as the battle reached its critical point, Fletcher would make a decision that his critics still argue about. He transferred tactical command to Fitch, acknowledging that the aviator was better suited to manage the complexities of the air battle that was developing. It was an unusual act of institutional humility, an admission that the man in command was not the best man for the specific task the moment required. Whether that transfer of authority came early enough, or whether it changed anything that mattered, is one of the questions that historians have debated ever since. Below these two admirals were the men who actually flew. The pilots of Lexington's and Yorktown's air groups were a varied collection, some of them seasoned veterans of pre-war carrier operations, others newly trained ensigns who had received their wings in the rapidly expanding programs that the Navy had launched after Pearl Harbor to build the aviator force it was going to need. They flew three basic types of aircraft: the Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter, a sturdy, somewhat underpowered machine that was outperformed in many respects by the Japanese Zero, but that could take enormous punishment and keep flying; the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, an elegant, accurate aircraft that would prove to be one of the most effective weapons in the Pacific War; and the Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, an older design that was already showing its age by 1942. The combination of these three aircraft fighters for defense, dive bombers for precision attacks on carriers, torpedo bombers for low-level strikes, was the tactical vocabulary of carrier aviation in the first year of the Pacific War. The Japanese aircrews they would face were, by virtually every measure, more experienced. The pilots of Shōkaku and Zuikaku had trained for years under a system that produced extraordinary individual skill at the price of small numbers. Japan could produce fewer pilots than America, and losing experienced aviators was a cost it could not absorb for long. But in the spring of 1942, that future cost was not yet visible. What was visible was the quality of the Japanese strike crews, their accuracy, their coordination, their aggression. American fighter pilots had already encountered Japanese aviators in the months since Pearl Harbor and come away with a healthy respect for their capabilities. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, and had a longer range than the Wildcat. In a straight dogfight at high altitude, the Zero usually won. American tactics would have to compensate for that inferiority by other means, by teamwork, by altitude, by the willingness to avoid the one-on-one engagements that the Zero was designed to dominate. The enlisted men who served on these carriers, the mechanics, the ordnancemen, the damage control parties, the engineers were largely invisible in the histories that were written in the immediate aftermath of the battle. History, particularly naval history, has a tendency to ascend to the bridge and stay there, telling the story in terms of admirals and flag signals and strategic calculations. But the Battle of the Coral Sea was also fought in the engine rooms and the hangar bays and the damage control stations below the waterline. It was fought by men whose names are not recorded in most accounts, who made the decisions, sometimes the right ones, sometimes the wrong ones, sometimes the ones that saved the ship, and sometimes the ones that could not, that determined whether the ship survived or burned. Their story is part of this story. We will not forget them. Admiral Fletcher sailed his two task forces into the Coral Sea with a plan, as much as any plan was possible given the fragmentary nature of the intelligence he had received. Yorktown and Lexington would operate separately at first, joining up when the situation required combined action. They would seek contact with the Japanese invasion force and its carrier cover before the amphibious force could reach Port Moresby. They would, if the intelligence was right and the timing held, find the Japanese carriers and strike them before the carriers could find them. Find first, strike first. That was the doctrine, the principle that American carrier warfare had crystallized around in the years of pre-war exercises. In the Coral Sea, it would be tested for the first time against a real enemy, under real conditions, with consequences that were real and irreversible. The forces were in position. The calendar was turning toward the 4th of May, 1942. What happened next would be decided not just by admirals on bridges, but by search pilots peering into cloud-broken skies over a warm blue sea, looking for a ship or a shadow or a wake that might or might not be the enemy. Chapter 5. First Blood Tulagi and the Opening Moves. The battle that history would call the Battle of the Coral Sea did not begin with a grand fleet engagement. It began, as so many campaigns do, with something smaller and sharper and harder to classify: a raid on a harbour that the Japanese had just seized, executed with a speed and decisiveness that surprised even the Americans who ordered it. The island of Tulagi, in the Lower Solomon Islands, had been occupied by a Japanese landing force on the 3rd of May, 1942. The landing was part of Operation Mo Tulagi, was to become a seaplane base, extending Japanese reconnaissance coverage over the approaches to the Coral Sea and providing an anchor for the southern flank of Japan's new defensive perimeter. Rear Admiral Fletcher learned of the Tulagi landing late on the 3rd of May. Yorktown was, at that moment, sailing north of the area, with Lexington's task force roughly 100 miles away. Fletcher made a rapid decision. He would separate Yorktown from the combined force, turn north, and strike the Japanese at Tulagi before they could consolidate their position. It was an aggressive choice, made with the awareness that it meant operating without Lexington's fighter cover and with incomplete knowledge of what Japanese forces were present in the area. The decision tells you something important about Fletcher, something that gets lost in the retrospective criticisms of his caution. When he saw a clear opportunity to strike a target of genuine strategic value, he moved quickly. In the early hours of the 4th of May, Yorktown turned into the wind and launched her air group. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers flew northwest toward Tulagi while fighters provided escort. What they found when they arrived was not the concentration of warships that the initial reports had suggested. The harbour held destroyers, minesweepers, landing craft, and the equipment of a force still in the process of establishing itself. Yorktown's aircraft conducted 3 separate strike waves over the course of the day. They sank a destroyer, a transport, and several smaller vessels. They damaged other ships and disrupted the Japanese landing operation. By the measures available, tonnage sunk, installations damaged, the enemy's forward base program delayed. It was a meaningful result. But the Tulagi strike also revealed something that would matter greatly in the days ahead: the gap between the claims of returning pilots and the actual results on the water. After each wave returned to Yorktown, pilots reported spectacular results: multiple destroyers and cruisers sunk, transports destroyed, the harbour in ruins. The actual accounting, assembled carefully from Japanese records after the war, was considerably more modest. This was not dishonesty or cowardice on the part of the pilots. It was the nature of aerial bombing from moving aircraft against moving or anchored ships on a visually complex, reflective sea surface. Explosions looked like hits. Near misses generated the same visual signature as direct strikes from altitude. The fog of war in carrier aviation was, if anything, thicker than the fog that surrounded surface engagements, because the violence happened fast, at high speeds, and at distances that made precise observation almost impossible. The Tulagi strike established a pattern of overcounting, of optimistic reporting, of the dangerous gap between perceived and actual results that would haunt both sides throughout the battle that followed. The noise of the Tulagi strike, in every sense, reached the Japanese quickly. Shōkaku and Zuikaku, operating north of the Solomons, received reports of the American air attacks and began to vector south and west toward the Coral Sea. The Japanese carrier commander, Vice Admiral Takagi Takeo, was now aware that American carriers were in the area, but he did not yet know how many or precisely where. His task force and its escort ships began to move into the Coral Sea from the northeast, hunting. Meanwhile, the Port Moresby invasion convoy, the transports and their escorts, the heart of Operation Mo, continued on its planned route, moving south from Rabaul toward the Jomard Passage. The multiple pieces of the Japanese operation were now all in motion. Fletcher, for his part, moved Yorktown south to rendezvous with Lexington's task force. The 2 task forces joined on the 1st of May, and for the next several days they operated as a single combined force in the Coral Sea, refueling, receiving intelligence updates, and trying to piece together a picture of where the various Japanese forces actually were. The intelligence picture was, as it would remain throughout the battle, frustratingly incomplete. American search aircraft flew long, exhausting patrols over the empty sea. Some of them found things, some of them found nothing, some of them found something and reported it incorrectly. The search for the enemy in the Coral Sea was conducted in conditions of extreme navigational uncertainty, with aircraft that had limited range and limited communication equipment, over an ocean whose weather changed unpredictably and whose vast, featureless surface made every search a test of concentration and endurance. On the 6th of May, an Australian-American cruiser force under Rear Admiral John Crace was detached from the main carrier force and sent ahead to cover the Jomard Passage, the route through which the Port Moresby invasion convoy would have to pass. It was a sound decision. If the Japanese invasion force got through the passage while the carrier battle was still being fought, the whole purpose of the Coral Sea operation would be defeated. Crace's force had no carrier air cover. It had cruisers and destroyers and their organic anti-aircraft weapons and whatever Australian land-based aircraft could reach it. It was a thin shield to put across the path of an invasion fleet, but it was the shield that was available. The 7th of May was approaching, and on that day, the battle would find its first decisive moment. Something was about to be found, and what was found first would go a long way toward determining who survived the days that followed. Chapter 6. The Wrong Ship, the Right Moment, the Sinking of Shōkaku. The 7th of May, 1942, began with a mistake that could have been catastrophic and ended with a moment of genuine triumph. Both of those things happened because of the same relentless uncertainty that governed every hour of the Coral Sea battle. The uncertainty of search, of identification, of knowing what you were looking at from the cockpit of an aircraft moving at more than 200 miles an hour above a sea full of ships, some of them yours and some of them not. On the morning of the 7th, an American search pilot reported the sighting of a Japanese carrier and a cruiser in the Coral Sea. The report crackled through the communications system and reached Fletcher's flagship. It seemed, at last, to be the contact that the whole operation had been moving toward. Fletcher immediately ordered a full strike. Yorktown and Lexington turned into the wind and began launching every available aircraft: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighter escort. It was a maximum effort, committing the bulk of both carriers' striking power to a single attack. The strike aircraft flew toward the reported position and found not a carrier and a cruiser, but an oiler and a destroyer. USS Neosho, an American fleet oiler, and her escort destroyer USS Sims had been misidentified as a Japanese carrier force. The strike aircraft, finding no carrier at the reported coordinates, turned and flew back toward the carriers. It was a costly error in wasted fuel, wasted time, and wasted flying hours for exhausted crews. The actual Japanese carriers were elsewhere. The Japanese made a precisely equivalent error the same morning. Their search aircraft found Neosho and Sims and, using the same confusion between oiler and carrier that had misled the Americans, reported them as a carrier and a cruiser. The Japanese carrier force launched a major strike at the two American vessels. The strike found Neosho and Sims and attacked them with full force. Sims was sunk. Neosho was left burning and adrift, her crew clinging to a stricken vessel in the middle of the Coral Sea, where they would remain for several days before rescue found them. Neither of these two ships was what either side had believed it to be finding. The battle was being fought, in part, against the wrong targets, a fact that would have been almost comical if the cost in lives had not been real. But the morning of the 7th also contained a discovery that was not a mistake. American search aircraft operating from a different sector of the search pattern, under clearer skies, found the Japanese light carrier Shōkaku operating with its heavy cruiser escort as the close covering force for the Port Moresby invasion convoy. Shōkaku was not Shōkaku or Zuikaku. She was smaller, less powerful, carrying fewer aircraft. But she was a carrier, and she was real, and her position had been confirmed. The report reached Fletcher, and the strike order went out immediately. Lexington launched her air group. Yorktown's strike was already airborne from an earlier search. and the combined force descended on Shōho with overwhelming force. What happened to Shōho was quick and absolute. She was struck repeatedly by dive bombers and torpedo aircraft in a coordinated attack that left her burning from bow to stern. The attack lasted minutes, not hours. Shōho, struck by multiple torpedoes and bombs in rapid succession, lost steerage way, lost the ability to recover or launch aircraft, and within a short time slipped beneath the surface. The radio transmission that her loss generated relayed by the voice of Lieutenant Commander Robert E. Dixon, the scout bombing squadron leader who had tracked her position, became one of the most quoted signals of the entire Pacific War. Dixon's transmission was direct, factual, and carried in its plainness a kind of exultant relief. "Scratch one flat top." Those 3 words, "scratch one flat top," resonated far beyond the tactical significance of the ship they announced. Shōho was the first Japanese carrier sunk by the United States Navy in the war. She was not a fleet carrier, not the kind of target that changed strategic balances on her own, but she was real. She had been found, attacked, and sunk by American carrier aircraft using American doctrine in the first great test of what the Navy's years of pre-war training had actually built. It was proof that the concept worked. It was proof that American carrier aviation could find and destroy an enemy carrier, could coordinate a strike group from 2 different carriers and bring it to bear on a single target with enough precision and weight to be decisive. That proof mattered. It would matter even more in the weeks ahead. The loss of Shōho had an immediate operational consequence. The Port Moresby invasion convoy, deprived of its close carrier cover, turned back. The transports and their escorts reversed course and withdrew to wait for new orders. The amphibious heart of Operation Mo had been checked, at least temporarily, but the battle was not over. It was, in some ways, only now beginning to find its true shape because Shōkaku and Zuikaku were still out there, still searching, and on the evening of the 7th of May, they would make an attempt to strike the American carriers in a night torpedo attack that would fail, but that announced, with unmistakable clarity, that the following morning would bring the full force of the Japanese carrier striking power into contact with Lexington and Yorktown. The mistake and the triumph of the 7th had both been real, but the 7th was prologue. The 8th of May, 1942, was the battle itself, carrier against carrier, air group against air group, for the first time in naval history. Nothing that had happened before prepared anyone, on either side, for what was coming. And on 2 flight decks separated by roughly 170 miles of open sea, sailors and pilots and mechanics worked through the night to be ready when the dawn came. If you have made it this far into tonight's documentary, thank you sincerely. You are exactly the kind of audience this channel exists for. Please hit the subscribe button if you have not already, and leave a comment below telling us which chapter you found most compelling. Your engagement helps this channel reach more viewers who love history, told with the depth it deserves. Chapters 7 through 18 are coming, and the story of what happens on the 8th of May and what happens after is extraordinary. Stay with us. Chapter 7. The night between tension, search, and the eve of battle. There is a particular quality to the hours before a battle that soldiers and sailors have described across centuries of warfare, and it is not quite what the imagination expects. It is not the heightened awareness of a man bracing for impact. It is not the cold clarity of a mind stripped to its essentials by the proximity of danger. It is, more often than not, something quieter and stranger, a suspension, a held breath, an awareness that the ordinary rhythms of existence have not yet stopped, but are about to. On the night of the 7th of May, 1942, that quality settled over every ship in the Coral Sea, American and Japanese alike, with the weight of everything that the next morning would bring. The American carriers had spent the afternoon recovering their aircraft from the Shōho strike and processing the results. The flight decks were busy with the mechanical business of war aircraft being refueled, rearmed, inspected, and spotted for the next day's operations. Ordnancemen moved bombs and torpedoes through the hangar bays in the low amber light of battle lamps. Mechanics worked on engines and landing gear. In the ready rooms, those cramped, tobacco-hazed compartments where pilots sat between their missions in leather chairs with plotting boards on their laps. The aviators were being briefed and debriefed, their accounts of the Shōkaku attack cross-referenced and mapped, the intelligence picture updated as best it could be. The mood was not celebratory, exactly. The sinking of Shōkaku had been real and welcome, but every experienced man on those ships understood that the fleet carriers were still out there, and the engagement that would define the operation had not yet happened. The Japanese carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, were, at that same hour, somewhere to the northeast, moving under the same cloud-broken sky, conducting the same nighttime preparations. Vice Admiral Takagi's staff had been processing their own search reports, assembling their own incomplete picture of where the American carriers were located. The loss of Shōkaku had been reported. The failure of the morning strike, the wasted effort against Neosho and Sims was being digested. And now Takagi made a decision that, in retrospect, says a great deal about the aggressive doctrine that governed Japanese carrier operations in this period of the war. He ordered a twilight strike. A small force of torpedo aircraft and bombers would fly toward the last reported American position and attempt a night attack, a tactic that the Japanese had practiced, but that was, even by the standards of experienced aviators, extremely demanding. The twilight strike launched from Shōkaku and Zuikaku in the early evening, flying toward the southwest in the fading light. What followed was a confused, dangerous, and ultimately unsuccessful engagement. The Japanese aircraft, navigating in deteriorating visibility, stumbled into the combat air patrol that Yorktown and Lexington had maintained over the task force. Fighters from both carriers intercepted the Japanese strike group in conditions of such poor light and such disorienting confusion that, at one point, some of the Japanese aircraft, desperately short of fuel and navigation landmarks, began to approach Yorktown's landing pattern, apparently mistaking her for one of their own carriers. The lights of the American task force were visible. The Japanese aircraft were calling in on frequencies that American radar operators could track. For a few extraordinary minutes, the two sides were almost interleaved in the same patch of sky, separated by darkness and the impossibility of reliable identification. The Japanese aircraft eventually disengaged, having found no target. Several were lost to American fighters and to the sea. On the return flight, the night, the fuel consumption of the search, and the stress of carrier recovery in darkness took their toll. The strike had accomplished nothing tactically, but it had accomplished something psychologically, if unintentionally. Every man on every American ship in the Coral Sea who monitored the radio traffic that evening, who watched the radar screens, who stared into the dark sky trying to separate the sounds of friendly and hostile engines, every one of them understood, with fresh and visceral clarity, that the next day was going to be something different from what had come before. Shōkaku had been relatively easy. Shōkaku and Zuikaku would not be. The night settled in. The equatorial sky was thick with stars in the gaps between the clouds. The sea ran in long, slow swells under the keels of the ships. Below decks, in the berthing compartments, some men slept the deep sleep of physical exhaustion. Others could not sleep at all. Officers bent over charts in the dim glow of red-lensed lamps, drawing and redrawing courses, calculating fuel states, estimating where the Japanese would be at dawn. Pilots lay on their bunks in their flight gear, some of them reading letters from home, some of them staring at the overhead, some of them going through the motions of their upcoming missions in the silent theatre of their own minds. This was the night between the first act of the battle and the decisive one, between the warm-up and the thing itself. Fletcher and his staff were acutely aware that the morning would require a complete intelligence picture that they did not yet have. They knew the Japanese carriers were somewhere to the northeast. They had ranges and estimates, but estimates are not coordinates, and in carrier warfare coordinates are everything. Launch your strike in the wrong direction by even a few degrees, and your aircraft will find empty ocean burning up fuel they need to get home. The search plans for the pre-dawn hours of the 8th of May were drawn up carefully, with sectors assigned to search aircraft from both carriers, from the cruisers, from whatever Australian shore-based aircraft could contribute to the coverage. Every sector of ocean that might conceal a Japanese carrier force had to be covered before the sun came fully up. Because whoever found the other side first, whoever got their search report back to the flagship first, would have the advantage that carrier doctrine said was decisive. Find first, strike first. It was the entire principle of carrier warfare, compressed into 4 words. The Japanese search plan for the same morning was, by a remarkable coincidence of professional thinking, almost identical in its logic. Takagi's staff had assigned search sectors to their aircraft as well, had calibrated their coverage patterns to find the Americans before being found. Both sides, separated by roughly 170 miles of dark water, were making the same calculations, running the same equations, reaching for the same principle that both navies had independently developed in their years of pre-war exercises. Neither side had a decisive advantage in doctrine or planning at this point. What would separate them in the morning would be something smaller, more contingent, more difficult to predict. The precise timing of a search contact, the clearness or cloudiness of a particular patch of sky, the judgment of a single pilot in the cockpit of a search aircraft who would have perhaps 60 seconds to make a report that would determine the course of the entire battle. The stars faded before dawn. The sea lightened from black to grey to the particular pale blue of the Coral Sea in early morning. On both sides, the search aircraft were already in the air, flying their sectors, their crews squinting at the brightening horizon. On both sides, the strike aircraft were spotted on the flight decks, engines warmed and ready, pilots strapped in and waiting for the word that contact had been made. The longest night in both task forces was ending. What the morning would bring had been building for weeks, through the intelligence operations, through the planning in Tokyo and Pearl Harbor, through the long transits across thousands of miles of ocean, through the careers and the training and the choices of every man now waiting for the sun. The 8th of May, 1942, was beginning. Chapter 8. The Search Eyes over the Coral Sea. Before any carrier battle can happen, someone has to find the enemy. This sounds simple. In practice, in the Coral Sea, in 1942, it was one of the most demanding and consequential tasks in the entire operation. The search aircraft, torpedo bombers and scout aircraft modified for reconnaissance, operating at the far edge of their fuel range, flew predetermined sectors of ocean in the pre-dawn darkness and the early morning light, their crews scanning an ocean surface that was, from altitude, a shifting, reflective, patternless expanse offering few landmarks and constant visual ambiguity. A ship at sea, from several thousand feet, in certain lighting conditions, can look remarkably like nothing at all. A wake that is clearly visible from one angle disappears entirely from another. Cloud shadow mimics a ship's silhouette. The search was, in the most fundamental sense, a test of human vision and human concentration under conditions of sustained fatigue. On the American side, Yorktown's and Lexington's search aircraft launched before full daylight on the 8th of May. The sectors assigned to each aircraft represented careful calculations of where the Japanese force most likely was, based on the track data from the previous evening's twilight strike, the radio direction finding fixes that had been worked up overnight, and the professional judgment of the carrier air staff officers who had spent the night with charts and pencils and inadequate information. The search was not a guarantee. It was a probability calculation, a bet, placed at the cost of aircraft and fuel and human endurance, that the Japanese were somewhere within the envelope of coverage. Several of the search aircraft were flying into sectors where the Japanese were almost certainly not. Others were flying toward the sector where Shōkaku and Zuikaku actually were. None of the pilots knew which category they fell into until they either found something or reached the far end of their search leg and turned for home empty-handed. The Japanese search effort was proceeding in parallel, under the same conditions, with the same uncertainties. Shōkaku and Zuikaku had launched their own pre-dawn search aircraft, fanning out to the southwest and west, covering the arc of ocean where the American carriers were most likely to be found. The Japanese search aircrew were experienced, well-trained and flying aircraft with navigation equipment that was, in several respects, comparable to what the Americans were using. The cloud cover over the Coral Sea on the morning of the 8th was patchy and uneven, thick in some areas, thin in others, and this would matter enormously before the morning was over. The American carriers, as it turned out, were operating under clear skies. The Japanese carriers were, at the crucial moment, partially concealed under a weather front that reduced visibility and made visual detection from above far more difficult. The crucial contact reports came in from both sides within minutes of each other. An American search aircraft found the Japanese carrier force and transmitted a position report. A Japanese search aircraft, almost simultaneously, found the American task force under its clear sky and transmitted its own report. The search phase of the battle, the long, exhausting, uncertain hunt through hundreds of miles of open ocean, was over. Now the race was to get strike aircraft in the air and on their way before the other side's strike aircraft arrived. The principle of finding first, striking first, was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Both sides had found each other at roughly the same time. The symmetry of the discovery removed the advantage that early contact was supposed to provide. What remained was the pure trial of the strike itself: who would hit harder, who would hurt the other side more severely before the other side could respond. Fletcher, acting on the contact report, made the decision to transfer tactical command of the air battle to Rear Admiral Fitch, the aviator. It was the right call for the moment, and Fletcher deserves credit for making it without the kind of institutional ego that might have prevented a surface officer from acknowledging the limits of his own expertise. Fitch took over and immediately began directing the launch. Lexington and Yorktown both began turning into the wind, their engines working up to the revolutions needed to give the flight deck the wind speed that strike aircraft required for takeoff. Aircraft were moved from their spotted positions to the launch point. The sequence of launch fighters, first for combat air patrol, then dive bombers, then torpedo planes, was the product of years of peacetime exercises compressed into a few frantic minutes of real-world execution. Every aircraft had to be in the air and formed up on course before fuel consumption made the mission impossible. The clock that had been ticking since the first search contact was now running against everyone. The strike groups from both carriers formed up overhead and set out on their courses toward the Japanese position. The distance was not trivial, roughly 170 to 190 miles. Depending on the exactness of the search plot, and the aircraft would be near the edge of their fuel endurance by the time they reached the target, attacked, and attempted to return. The pilots knew this. Torpedo bomber crews, in particular, knew that if the attack required extended maneuvering, if they had to circle to find their attack angle, or if they encountered intense opposition that forced evasive action, they might not have enough fuel to make it back. The decision to fly the mission anyway was not courage in the dramatic sense. It was the steady, considered acceptance of a professional risk that the mission required. They had been trained for this. The training had been good. Now it would be tested. The same calculation was being made in the cockpits of the Japanese strike aircraft flying in the opposite direction. Shōkaku and Zuikaku's air groups, torpedo bombers and dive bombers, with a fighter escort, were on their course toward the American carriers. These were, in the aggregate, a more experienced force than the Americans they were flying toward. The Pearl Harbor veterans among them had conducted multiple combat operations. Their torpedo attack doctrine was refined and aggressive. Their dive bombing accuracy had been demonstrated repeatedly. And they had an advantage the American strike groups did not. The American carriers were operating under clear skies, fully visible to any approaching aircraft, while the Japanese carriers remained partially concealed under cloud. This asymmetry, one side visible, the other obscured, would shape the battle's final accounting in ways that no one could fully predict as the strike groups crossed the blue emptiness of the Coral Sea toward each other. In the skip between those two formations of aircraft, converging on each other's ships from opposite directions, the entire fate of the battle, and much that hung on the battle, was suspended. The morning was clear and bright over the American task force. The sun was well up. The carriers were visible from miles away. On the radar screens of the escort ships, the approaching Japanese strike began to appear as the distance closed. The combat air patrol fighters were vectored toward the incoming threat. The anti-aircraft guns were loaded, their crews at their stations. The battle was no longer a matter of search and strategy. It was a matter of seconds and steel and the narrow, fiery corridor through which every attacking aircraft would have to fly. Everything was in motion. Nothing could be recalled. The 8th of May, 1942, was doing what it had been building toward since the first days of the Pacific War. Chapter 9. Blows exchanged the carrier duel of the 8th of May. Naval battles have a quality of compression that is difficult to convey in language. What seems, in the planning stage, like a broad strategic engagement, two carrier forces maneuvering over hundreds of miles of ocean collapses at the moment of contact into a series of violent, short, intensely local events that happen simultaneously and that nobody in the middle of them can fully see or understand. The carrier duel of the 8th of May, 1942, lasted, in its most intense phase, less than an hour. In that hour, the balance of the Pacific War shifted, not definitively, not cleanly, but perceptibly and permanently. Both sides struck hard, both sides suffered, and the outcome was not what either side had intended. The American strike groups reached the Japanese carrier force shortly after 11 in the morning, local time. The weather over the Japanese position had, as the search pilot's report suggested, thickened somewhat, and Zuikaku, one of the two Japanese fleet carriers, was obscured under a heavy rain squall. The American strike aircraft found Shōkaku, her sister ship, operating in clearer air and concentrated their attacks on her. Dive bombers from both Yorktown and part of Lexington's air group pushed over into their dives and came down the steep, fast attack angles that the SBD Dauntless was designed for. The Japanese fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire were intense. Not every aircraft that began its dive completed it. Some were hit during the approach, some pulled out early. But enough of them held their course and released at the right altitude to put bombs on Shōkaku. Shōkaku was hit by bombs. The exact count in different accounts varies, but the result was clear. She sustained serious damage to her flight deck, which prevented her from launching further strike aircraft, and fires were started that required sustained damage control effort to contain. She could no longer operate as a strike platform. Her remaining aircraft that were airborne would have to recover aboard Zuikaku, which would itself not launch another strike. The American dive-bombing attack had effectively neutralized one of the two Japanese fleet carriers as a striking force, even if it had not sunk her. Shōkaku turned away, escorted by destroyers, beginning the long withdrawal to Japan for repairs that would keep her out of the next carrier battle. Zuikaku, unhurt in the attack because the weather had concealed her, remained intact, but with a depleted air group, she had absorbed the surviving aircraft from Shōkaku, but her own strike crew had suffered losses over the American task force. The torpedo attack portion of the American strike was less successful. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, flying their slow, low, straight attack runs, were the most vulnerable aircraft in the American inventory to fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire. The attack required long, committed approach runs that gave defending fighters and gunners maximum time to bring them under fire. Several were lost. The torpedoes that were launched running at their set depth and speed toward Shōkaku failed to achieve the results the attack geometry had suggested they might. The torpedo problem, unreliable weapons, inadequate attack doctrine for the speed and maneuverability of the targets would haunt American carrier aviation for much of the next year. At Coral Sea, it was visible but not yet fully understood. The post-war analysis would expose the full dimensions of the problem. In the moment, the aviators knew only that their weapons had not performed as expected. While the American strike was hitting Shōkaku, the Japanese strike was hitting Lexington and Yorktown. The two American carriers, operating in clear weather, were approached by a coordinated attack of dive bombers and torpedo bombers that their combat air patrol could only partially intercept. The Wildcat fighters of the combat air patrol fought hard. They knocked down a number of Japanese aircraft. The anti-aircraft fire from the escort ships contributed. But the Japanese attack was conducted with skill and determination, and enough aircraft got through the defenses to deliver their weapons on target. The attack against the American task force began shortly after 11. Roughly simultaneously with the American attack on Shōkaku, the symmetry of the carrier duel was almost mechanical, both sides hitting the other at the same moment, neither able to break off to defend without sacrificing the attack. That was the only way to reduce the threat. Yorktown took a direct bomb hit. The bomb punched through several decks and detonated deep inside the ship, killing a number of her crew and starting fires below the hangar deck. She also absorbed near-misses bombs that detonated in the water close alongside, sending shockwaves through her hull. But Yorktown's damage, serious as it was, did not compromise her ability to maneuver or to continue flight operations in the short term. Her damage control teams went to work immediately, fighting the fires and assessing the structural damage. The carrier kept moving, kept recovering aircraft. She had been hurt badly enough that her admirals and engineers would later estimate months of repair work would be required, but she was still in the fight. Lexington took the heavier punishment. She was struck by 2 torpedoes on her port side, one after the other, the impact separated by only seconds. The torpedoes opened her hull to the sea in 2 places, and the flooding that followed caused her to list to lean to one side by roughly 7 degrees. At almost the same time, she absorbed 3 bomb hits from the dive bombing element of the Japanese attack. The combined effect was serious, but not, in the immediate judgment of her captain and damage control officer, fatal. Her fires were manageable. Her flooding was being counter-flooded. Her engine rooms reported that she could still make 25 knots fast enough to continue operations. By early afternoon, Lexington's damage control parties had done something remarkable. They had brought the fires under control, corrected the list to near zero, and returned the ship to operational capability. She began recovering her returning aircraft. She signaled the task force that she was ready to resume operations. For about an hour, it seemed that Lady Lex had survived the worst the Japanese could throw at her. The battle had been exchanged in full. Both sides had struck. Both sides had suffered. Shōkaku was withdrawing, damaged and unable to launch aircraft. Lexington was recovering her aircraft, apparently stabilized, apparently fighting. Yorktown was hurt but operational. On the balance sheet of the morning's strikes, the outcome was not a clear victory for either side. It was, at that moment, something closer to a draw, 2 bloodied opponents stepping back from each other, both having damaged the other without achieving the decisive destruction that carrier doctrine demanded. But the accounting of the day was not yet complete. Something was happening below Lexington's flight deck that no one on board yet fully understood. The damage control teams had done extraordinary work, but they had not been able to seal everything. Deep inside the ship, in the spaces around the machinery and the fuel systems, something was building quietly, invisibly, with the patient inevitability of physics. Chapter 10. The Loss of Lady Lex Fire, Decision, and Farewell. The explosion came without warning. At approximately 1300 hours on the 8th of May, 1942, roughly 2 hours after the Japanese attack, at a moment when Lexington was recovering her aircraft and her crew was beginning, cautiously, to believe the worst was over, a massive detonation erupted from deep within the ship. It was not a torpedo, it was not a bomb. It was the ignition of gasoline vapors fuel that had leaked from ruptured aviation gasoline lines deep in the ship's interior, mixing with air in the enclosed spaces of the lower decks, accumulating in invisible, odorless concentration until a spark from a motor or a generator set it off. The explosion shook the entire ship. Men on the flight deck were knocked off their feet. Men below decks, working at their damage control stations, found themselves in the middle of an inferno that had been, 1 moment before, a manageable repair task. The gasoline vapor problem was not, in retrospect, unique to Lexington. It was a vulnerability built into the design of carriers of that era, ships that carried thousands of gallons of aviation fuel in tanks and lines that ran throughout the ship, connecting the hangar bay systems to the fueling points on the flight deck. In normal operations, with the ventilation systems working and the fuel lines intact, the vapors were managed and dispersed. But torpedo hits that ruptured fuel lines, combined with the damage to ventilation systems that such hits produced, created conditions in which vapors could accumulate in dangerous concentrations, especially in the enclosed spaces of a large ship where air circulation was limited. The lesson was there to be learned. The Navy would learn it painfully and thoroughly and apply it to every subsequent carrier design. But Lexington was the lesson itself, not the student. After the first explosion, others followed. Each detonation spread fire further through the ship's interior. Damage control parties, which had spent the previous 2 hours fighting the fires from the Japanese attack, now faced something of a different order, a cascading series of explosions, feeding fires that spread faster than they could be contained. The engines were still running, the ship was still moving. Captain Frederick C. Sherman, on the bridge, was receiving damage reports from throughout the ship and making the assessment that every commanding officer in this situation must eventually make, whether the ship can still be saved or whether the moment has come to think about saving the men. Sherman was a skilled officer, deeply attached to his command. He did not reach the second conclusion easily. By early afternoon, the situation below decks had become untenable. The fires were beyond the capacity of the damage control teams to fight effectively. The explosions were becoming more frequent and more severe. The structural integrity of sections of the ship was being compromised. At 15:58, Captain Sherman ordered all hands to the flight deck a preparatory step, a gathering of the crew in the safest available place, before the order that everyone now knew was coming. The men came up from below, some of them burned, many of them covered in smoke and oil, some of them carrying their shipmates who could not walk on their own. They assembled on the flight deck with the discipline that their training had built, no panic, no stampede, the organized movement of a crew that had been well led and well prepared for this moment, even though no one had wanted to prepare for it. At 1707, Captain Sherman ordered abandon ship. The word went out through the ship's communications system, and by voice from officer to officer, division to division, compartment to compartment. The crew went over the side in an orderly fashion, some of them sliding down lines to the water, others jumping, all of them moving into the warm waters of the Coral Sea, where the escort ships, cruisers and destroyers had moved close alongside to recover them. Rear Admiral Fitch and his staff transferred to USS Minneapolis. Captain Sherman and his executive officer remained on the flight deck until they were the last men aboard, making certain that their crew was off the ship before they themselves left. This act, the captain last off a sinking ship, was not merely tradition, it was the statement of everything a commanding officer owed to the men under his command. The rescue operations went remarkably well. The warm water temperature, the calm sea state, the presence of multiple escort ships, and the organized nature of the abandoned ship, all of these factors combined to allow the recovery of the vast majority of Lexington's crew. More than 2,500 men were pulled from the water. The losses, in a disaster of this scale and in the conditions of active combat, were less than they might have been. More than 200 men were lost killed in the attack, in the explosions, in the fires, in the water. Each of those losses was complete and irreplaceable in the way that every human loss is. But against the scale of the catastrophe, the survival of more than 2,500 men was itself a form of achievement, the product of training, leadership, and the cool professionalism of the escort commanders who moved their ships into harm's way to collect the survivors. Lexington continued to burn after her crew left her. The flames reached hundreds of feet into the air above her flight deck, visible from miles away in the clear afternoon sky. She was still afloat, burning like a torch, and as long as she floated even in this condition, there was the remote possibility that she might be captured or examined by the Japanese. USS Phelps, a destroyer, was ordered to finish the task that the Japanese attack had begun. She moved to within approximately 1,400 yards of the burning carrier and fired 2 torpedoes into Lexington's hull. After one final, enormous explosion, the last convulsion of a ship that had been burning for hours, Lexington slipped beneath the surface of the Coral Sea at 19:56 on the evening of the 8th of May, 1942. She was gone. The ship that had been commissioned on the 14th of December, 1927, that had carried the Navy's first carrier doctrine across 14 years of Pacific exercises, that had launched the aircraft that fought and beaten the Japanese over Shōkaku. She was 2 miles beneath the surface of the ocean that bore her name. The men who had served on her would carry the weight of that loss for the rest of their lives. The Navy would carry it differently as a lesson, as a data point, as one of the most expensive pieces of engineering knowledge ever purchased. Everything the Navy learned from the loss of Lady Lex about fuel system design, about vapor management, about damage control procedures, went into the ships that came after her. She was gone, but the knowledge her loss produced was not. That knowledge would save lives. It already had, because the lessons that damage control teams took from Lexington's loss would be applied, within weeks, to a battered and badly damaged Yorktown in a dry dock at Pearl Harbor. As the Navy prepared for the next carrier battle, the loss of one ship was feeding the survival of another. That is not consolation. But it is the way that warfare, at its most brutal and most purposeful, actually works. Chapter 11. Counting the Cost. What the Coral Sea Decided. When the guns fell silent on the 8th of May and the two battered carrier forces drew apart the Japanese retreating north, the Americans south, the immediate question that every commander on both sides was asking was the same: who had won? It was a question that would take weeks, and in some respects decades, to answer fully. In the immediate accounting, the Japanese appeared to have done better. They had sunk a fleet carrier Lexington with her 14 years of service and her air group's accumulated expertise. They had left Yorktown damaged and limping toward Pearl Harbor for repairs. Their own losses had been lighter in terms of fleet carriers. Shōkaku was damaged but not sunk. Zuikaku was essentially intact. On the strict ledger of major warships, the Japanese had the better of the exchange. But the exchange looked different when you widened the frame. The Port Moresby invasion convoy had turned back. The amphibious operation at the heart of Operation Mo, the strategic objective for which the entire Japanese naval force had been committed, had failed. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. The sea lanes connecting Australia and New Zealand to the United States remained open. The goal of cutting Australia off from American support, of establishing a Japanese base on the continent's northern doorstep from which land-based aircraft could threaten Australian cities, all of that had been prevented. Not permanently. Not without further fighting. But prevented for now, and the now mattered enormously, because every week that Japan failed to advance its strategic position was a week in which American shipyards were laying keels and American factories were producing aircraft, and American training commands were producing pilots. The cost to the Japanese in aircraft and aircrew was, in some ways, the most consequential part of the ledger. Shōkaku and Zuikaku together had lost a significant portion of their experienced air groups. The specific numbers varied in different accounts, but the conclusion was consistent. Both carriers would need to rebuild their air groups with replacement crews before they could operate effectively again. The time required for this rebuilding would prove fateful. In the first week of June, barely a month after the Coral Sea, the decisive naval battle of the Pacific War would be fought near the island of Midway. Shōkaku was still under repair. Zuikaku's air group was still being reconstituted. Neither carrier would be present at Midway. And at Midway, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of the force that had struck Pearl Harbor, would be destroyed. Had Shōkaku and Zuikaku been present and fully operational at Midway, the balance of that battle might have been different. The Coral Sea's most important consequence was not what it did directly. It was what it prevented from being at Midway. Yorktown's survival and the speed of her repair was itself one of the remarkable stories of this period. After the 8th of May, she made her way to Pearl Harbor carrying her bomb damage and her casualties, her crew working throughout the transit to do what damage control they could. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz made a calculation that contemporaries considered nearly impossible. He told his engineers that Yorktown needed to be ready to sail again in 72 hours. The engineering estimate was 3 months. Nimitz, aware of what the intelligence picture suggested was coming at Midway, gave his workers 3 days. More than 1,400 workers, civilian contractors, and Navy personnel worked around the clock in shifts, welding steel plates over the damaged sections, repairing systems, re-racking ammunition, refueling. In 48 hours, Yorktown was out of the dry dock. She was not fully repaired. She was, in the engineering sense, a patched and imperfect ship. But she was a functioning carrier, and she sailed for Midway on the 30th of May, 1942. The lessons that the Coral Sea taught about carrier operations were processed with remarkable speed by the American naval establishment. The fuel vapor problem, the cascade of explosions that had killed Lexington, was addressed in the damage control procedures applied to Yorktown and in the design modifications applied to subsequent carriers. The performance of the combat air patrol, which had been only partially effective against the coordinated Japanese strike, generated analysis and procedural changes in how fighters were vectored and directed. The accuracy problems with the torpedo attack, the difficulties the TBD devastators had encountered, the failures of the torpedoes themselves were noted and eventually addressed, though the full solution to the torpedo problem would take considerably longer to implement. The overcounting of results, the gap between pilot reports and actual damage inflicted, was recognized and factored into the planning processes for future operations. The Japanese drew their own lessons with their own blind spots. The success of the torpedo attack on Lexington was noted and affirmed existing doctrine. The loss of Shōkaku was attributed, reasonably, to the vulnerability of a light carrier operating without adequate fighter cover in an area where American carrier aircraft were present. But the broader implications of what had happened, the fact that the American carriers had found and struck Shōkaku effectively, had damaged her severely enough to remove her from the next battle, had demonstrated that American carrier aviation was a credible and dangerous opponent, were perhaps not weighted as heavily as they should have been in the Japanese assessments that followed. The Japanese still believed, as they prepared for Midway, that American carrier forces could be overwhelmed by superior numbers and superior experience. They were not entirely wrong about the experience gap. They were very wrong about the numbers and about what was waiting for them at Midway. The sailors who had served on Lexington, the 2,500 and more who had gone over the side in good order and been pulled from the Coral Sea by their escort ships, were distributed across the fleet. Many of them returned to sea almost immediately, assigned to other carriers, other ships, carrying with them the experience of having fought in the first carrier battle in history and the specific, hard knowledge of what carrier damage looked like from the inside. Their experience was a resource. Their knowledge of damage control, of firefighting, of the specific ways that a torpedoed carrier behaved, all of it was distributed through the fleet in the bodies and minds of those survivors. The institutional memory of Lexington's loss lived on in the men who had survived it. The Coral Sea was over, but what it had set in motion was not. The carriers were still at sea, the war was still in motion. And roughly a month in the future, at a place the Japanese called MI and the Americans called Midway, everything that the Coral Sea had started would reach its decisive conclusion. The road from the Coral Sea to Midway was shorter, in both distance and time, than anyone had expected. And it ran through the battered hull of Yorktown, patched and relaunched and sailing west under a Pacific sky, carrying the lessons of the Coral Sea into the battle that would define the war. Chapter 12. The wreck that waited discovery, memory, and legacy. For more than 75 years, Lexington lay where she had gone down on the evening of the 8th of May, 1942 in the Coral Sea, roughly 500 miles off the eastern coast of Australia, at a depth of nearly 2 miles. No one knew her exact position. The records of the battle gave approximate coordinates. The ocean floor in that part of the Coral Sea was mapped only in the coarsest terms. She was, in the formal language of naval administration, a known loss at an unknown location, a designation that covers a particular category of absence, the kind where you know what happened but cannot go and see it. For the families of the men who had served on her, for the veterans who had survived her loss, for the historians who had written about her, this absence had a specific texture. There was a gap in the story where the physical evidence should have been. On the 4th of March 2018, the research vessel RV Petrel, operating an expedition funded by the late Paul Allen, found her. the sonar contact resolved into an image on the screens of the survey team, and then the remotely operated vehicle descended through nearly 2 miles of water and brought back the images that the world had waited 76 years to see. Lexington was there. She was resting on the ocean floor largely intact, her hull preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor conditions of the deep sea. Her aircraft, including Grumman F-4F Wildcats and Douglas SBD Dauntlesses, were visible in the wreckage, some of them still recognizable as the machines they had been when they went down with the ship. The markings and identification numbers were still legible on some aircraft, connecting the images to specific aircraft and, in some cases, to specific pilots and crew members whose names were known. The discovery was, simultaneously, a moment of historical revelation and a moment of profound human weight. For the families of the more than 200 men who had died with Lexington, the discovery located their loved ones' final resting place with a precision that had never before been possible. The wreck is, in the legal and moral sense, a military gravesite protected under the laws governing sunken naval vessels, off-limits to salvage, managed as a memorial to the men who went down with her. The images released by the RV Petrel team were widely circulated, reaching audiences who had never heard of the Battle of the Coral Sea and drawing the attention of a new generation to a battle and a ship that had been, in the broader popular consciousness, somewhat overshadowed by the more famous engagements that followed it. Yorktown's wreck had been found earlier in 1998 by an expedition led by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had previously found the Titanic. She rested nearly 3 miles down in the Pacific, roughly 300 miles north of Midway Atoll, where she had finally sunk on the 7th of June, 1942, after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Her wreck, like Lexington's, was remarkably well preserved. In 2025, a NOAA expedition returned to Yorktown and sent remotely operated vehicles into her interior, discovering extraordinary artifacts, a hand-painted mural covering much of the hangar deck, depicting Yorktown's global voyages, a Ford station wagon, likely the ship's service vehicle, still sitting where it had been parked when the ship went down, and at least 3 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, one of them still carrying its bomb. The discoveries were extraordinary in themselves, but their deeper significance was the connection they provided between the present and the specific, personal texture of life on a warship in 1942. The legacy of the Coral Sea reaches further than its wrecks and its archives. It reaches into the design of every American aircraft carrier built after 1942, into the fuel system, specifications, the damage control procedures, the fighter direction doctrine, the strike coordination protocols that were all revised in the light of what the battle had taught. It reaches into the doctrine manuals and the training programs that shaped the American carrier force for the rest of the Pacific War. It reaches, indirectly, into the outcome at Midway, because the absence of Shōkaku and Zuikaku from that battle, their grounding in Japanese repair yards, was a direct consequence of the damage they had sustained in the Coral Sea. The battle that most people have heard of, Midway, the turning point of the Pacific War, was shaped by the battle that preceded it. The men who fought the Coral Sea returned, in the case of the survivors, to a navy that was learning faster than any naval institution in history. The rate of change in American carrier doctrine between the Coral Sea in May of 1942 and the great carrier battles of 1944, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, was extraordinary. New aircraft replaced the TBD Devastator. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat replaced the Wildcat as the primary carrier fighter, decisively reversing the performance gap with the Zero. Radar-directed fighter interception became systematic rather than ad hoc. Damage control procedures were standardized and trained exhaustively. The fuel vapor problem was engineered out of new designs and addressed in existing ships by carbon dioxide purging systems that could sweep the dangerous accumulations from enclosed spaces before they could ignite. The Navy that fought the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944 was a fundamentally different institution from the Navy that had sailed into the Coral Sea in May of 1942. The Coral Sea had started the transformation. The Australian dimension of the battle's legacy deserves particular recognition. Australia's position in 1942 was one of genuine strategic peril. The Japanese advance had reached the edge of the continent's defensive envelope. Port Moresby was the last substantial position between the Japanese advance and the northern Australian coast. Its fall would not necessarily have meant a Japanese invasion of Australia. The logistics of such an operation would have been formidable, but it would have fundamentally changed the strategic calculus for the defense of the continent and for any future Allied offensive from the South Pacific. The Australian Navy and Australian land-based aircraft had contributed to the Coral Sea operation, and the Australian public understood, at least in broad terms, that the battle had been fought partly on their behalf. The annual commemoration of the Battle of the Coral Sea, observed by both American and Australian naval forces, reflects a genuine historical bond forged in 5 days of fighting in May of 1942. The Coral Sea battle holds a unique place in the history of naval warfare that has nothing to do with its outcome. It was the first naval engagement in history in which the opposing surface fleets never came within sight of each other. The ships that fought the Coral Sea, the carriers, the cruisers, the destroyers, exchanged no fire directly. They never sighted each other on the horizon. The battle was conducted entirely through aircraft, at ranges of 150 miles and more, by machines that made the decision about where to attack and how, and by the men who flew them. This was carrier warfare as the theorists had imagined it, but more violent, more confused, and more consequential than any peacetime exercise had been able to simulate. The Coral Sea proved that the age of the carrier had truly arrived not as a supporting element to the battleship, but as the primary instrument of naval power in the modern era. Every American aircraft carrier that sails today, every nuclear-powered giant in the fleet, carries in its design lineage the lessons that were purchased in the Coral Sea. The names Lexington and Yorktown have been given to later ships in the Navy's history, a practice that is not merely sentimental but deliberate, a way of carrying the memory of what those ships and those men accomplished into the living institution of the fleet. Lady Lex is 2 miles down, in the sea that bears her battle's name, her aircraft still in their stalls, her wardroom furniture still in place in the cold dark. She is a monument that no committee commissioned and no architect designed. She is simply there, the way that the most important things in history are simply there, present, permanent, and asking to be remembered. If tonight's documentary has brought the Coral Sea to life for you, please leave a comment below with your thoughts and subscribe if you haven't already. Chapters 13 through 18 will carry this story through to its full and extraordinary conclusion. The water is warm, the night is long, we are far from done. Chapter 13. The Road to Midway, What the Coral Sea Set in Motion. History rarely announces its turning points in the moment they occur. The men who fought the Coral Sea did not know, as their ships pulled away from each other on the evening of the 8th of May, 1942, that they had just participated in the opening act of a sequence that would, within 30 days, fundamentally and permanently alter the balance of power in the Pacific. They knew they had fought hard. They knew they had lost a carrier. They knew the invasion convoy had turned back. What they could not yet see, what required the vantage point of time and outcome to become visible, was the chain of consequences their battle had set in motion. A chain that ran directly to a cluster of islands northwest of Hawaii and to the most decisive naval engagement of the 20th century. The immediate aftermath of the Coral Sea was, for the United States Navy, a mixture of grief, exhaustion, and urgent calculation. Yorktown was making her way northeast toward Pearl Harbor, her damage control parties still working on the bomb wound she had taken on the 8th of May. Her captain and crew knew the ship was not well. The hull frames bent by the bomb blast, the flooding that had been arrested, but not fully repaired, the systems that were working at reduced capacity, all of it was present in the daily engineering reports. But the more pressing question was not whether Yorktown was in good condition. The question was whether she could be made sufficiently operational, by whatever means, and in whatever time was available to be of use in the battle that American signals intelligence was already suggesting would happen in early June. Admiral Nimitz, at Pearl Harbor, was receiving intelligence assessments of remarkable specificity and remarkable import. The codebreakers whose work had made the Coral Sea intervention possible were reading Japanese naval traffic that described a major operation aimed at the island of Midway and, simultaneously, at the Aleutian chain in Alaska. The Japanese called the Midway Objective MI. The operation was large, complex, and clearly designed to draw out whatever remained of the American carrier force and destroy it. Yamamoto's strategic objective, the decisive fleet engagement that would cripple American naval power before American industrial capacity could tip the balance, was being set up for the first week of June. Nimitz understood this. His intelligence was not perfect. There were details he did not have, estimates that would prove incorrect, blind spots that the codebreakers had not yet penetrated. But the essential picture was there. A massive Japanese force was coming to Midway, and the carriers were the only force available to meet it. The arithmetic facing Nimitz in the last weeks of May, 1942, was stark in a way that is almost difficult to comprehend from the distance of 80 years. He had 3 carriers available in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, which had participated in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April, and the wounded Yorktown, limping toward Pearl Harbor for repairs that her engineers estimated would take 3 months. Against this, Yamamoto was bringing 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by a force that included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, and enough aircraft to overwhelm any defense Midway's garrison could offer. The numerical imbalance was not theoretical. It was explicit, visible, and deeply dangerous. 3 carriers against 4, with the American 3 including one that was barely functional. This was the situation the Coral Sea had produced not through failure, but through the particular, costly kind of success that the battle had achieved. And here is where the Coral Sea's contribution to Midway becomes most visible and most important. Had Shōkaku not been damaged at the Coral Sea, had her flight deck not been wrecked by American dive bombers on the 8th of May, she would have been available for Midway. Had Zuikaku's air group not suffered the losses it sustained over the American task force on that same day, she too could have been rebuilt and ready within 6 weeks. 2 additional fleet carriers at Midway, alongside Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would have meant 6 Japanese fleet carriers against Nimitz's 3. The balance of that battle, which was already precarious, might have broken entirely differently. The American carrier forces that checked Yamamoto at Midway could easily have been overwhelmed by the additional air power that Shōkaku and Zuikaku would have contributed. The Coral Sea had removed them from the equation. That removal was not coincidental. It was the direct consequence of the damage inflicted by Lexington's and Yorktown's air groups on the 8th of May. Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May, 1942. The inspection teams went aboard immediately, assessing the damage with the focused urgency of men who already knew their deadline. What they found was serious. The bomb damage had buckled internal frames, ruptured systems, destroyed compartments. The full repair was 3 months of work of that there was no technical doubt. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. The workers who descended on Yorktown in the last days of May, more than 1,400 of them, civilian shipyard employees and Navy personnel working in rotating shifts around the clock, were not performing a miracle of engineering so much as a miracle of prioritization. They were not fixing everything. They were fixing enough. Enough to get the ship to sea, enough to operate her air group, enough to fight one more battle, knowing that the deeper damage remained and would have to be addressed later, if there was a later. The repairs worked imperfectly, improvised, temporary, but sufficient. On the 30th of May, 48 hours after she had entered the dry dock, Yorktown left Pearl Harbor. She sailed northwest toward a rendezvous point northeast of Midway, designated Point Luck, where Enterprise and Hornet were waiting. The 3 carriers formed up. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, still in command of the Yorktown Task Force, took tactical command of the combined force. The force moved to its assigned position and settled in to wait for the Japanese fleet to commit itself. The intelligence picture suggested the attack on Midway would begin on the 4th of June. The American carriers would be positioned to strike the Japanese fleet from an unexpected angle from northeast, where Japanese search patterns were not expected to cover. The entire Midway operation rested on the intelligence edge and on the hope that the element of surprise, which the Japanese expected to have, would belong instead to the Americans. What Yamamoto did not know, what none of the Japanese operational planning had factored in, was that Yorktown was at sea. The Japanese believed, reasonably on the basis of the Coral Sea damage reports, that Yorktown was either sunk or so severely damaged as to require months of repair. They were planning around 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. A third carrier at the battle, appearing unexpectedly, operating where no carrier was supposed to be, would create exactly the kind of uncertainty and miscalculation that changes battles. Yorktown at Midway was, in a very real sense, Lexington's last contribution to the war. Lady Lex was gone, but the lessons her loss had taught, the damage control innovations, the fuel system procedures were embedded in Yorktown's repair and in her survival. The ship that had been saved was carrying the legacy of the ship that had been lost. The 4th of June, 1942, was 3 weeks away as Yorktown cleared Pearl Harbor's channel and turned northwest into the open Pacific. 3 weeks and a distance that, in carrier terms, was nothing a transit easily accomplished, a patrol box easily maintained. But in the weight of what those 3 weeks contained, in the strategic consequence of what was about to happen at Midway, the distance from the Coral Sea to those islands in the Central Pacific was the distance between the beginning of the American carrier war and its decisive test. The Coral Sea had been the warm-up. Midway was the examination, and the grade the American Navy received at Midway would be written in the language that wars ultimately use, in ships sunk and ships sailing, in carriers lost and carriers preserved, in the turning of a strategic tide that had been running strongly in one direction and was, on the 4th of June, going to turn. The road from the Coral Sea to Midway was built from loss and improvisation, and the extraordinary human capacity to learn under pressure. The men who built it, the workers in the Pearl Harbor dry dock, the intelligence analysts in the basement code rooms, the carrier captains and their crews, were not heroes in the cinematic sense. They were professionals doing an impossible job in impossible circumstances, sustained by training and habit and the specific kind of determination that comes from understanding exactly what failure would cost. They understood, and they went to work. Chapter 14. The Japanese perspective, confidence, calculation, and the cost of underestimation. To understand why the Coral Sea mattered as much as it did, you have to understand the world as the Imperial Japanese Navy saw it in the spring of 1942. Not as we see it now, with the knowledge of how everything ended, but as it appeared to the men making the decisions in Tokyo and aboard the great carriers of the combined fleet, men who had every reason, from their own experience and their own intelligence assessments, to believe that the momentum of the Pacific War was decisively in their favor. The gap between how the war looked from the Japanese side and how it was actually going to unfold is one of the most instructive and most sobering stories in the entire history of the conflict. It is a story about the particular danger of being right for long enough to start believing you cannot be wrong. The 6 months between Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea had given the Imperial Japanese Navy an unbroken record of operational success. The Pearl Harbor attack had been executed with precision that exceeded even the most optimistic planning assumptions. The subsequent drives through Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific had been conducted with a speed and coordination that had genuinely shocked the Allied commanders trying to respond to them. The naval engagements in those first months had consistently gone Japan's way. The sinking of the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse by Japanese land-based aircraft in December of 1941. The series of surface engagements in the Dutch East Indies in the first months of 1942, in which Japanese cruiser and destroyer forces had inflicted severe losses on Allied naval forces. The record was consistent, and consistency, in warfare, produces something dangerous. It produces the assumption that the conditions which generated the record will continue to hold. Japanese intelligence assessments of American carrier capabilities in the spring of 1942 were shaped by this record of success. and they were shaped by a genuine underestimation of American industrial capacity and American institutional adaptability. The Japanese Navy understood, at a technical level, that American carriers and aircraft were competent. What it underestimated was the rate at which American competence was improving the speed at which the Navy was learning from its early losses, revising its doctrine, training new crews, and building new ships. The industrial mobilization that was underway in American shipyards in the first half of 1942 was not yet visible in the performance of American forces at sea. The carriers that fought the Coral Sea were flying the same aircraft, using essentially the same doctrine as the carriers that had been in service on the 7th of December. But the carriers that would fight 6 months later were flying better aircraft, using better doctrine, guided by better intelligence, and supported by a logistics train of growing depth and capacity. Japan was measuring a moving target as if it were standing still. Admiral Yamamoto's Midway Plan Operation Me was in its strategic logic, sound given the assumptions it rested on. Drawing out the American carriers, destroying them in a fleet engagement before American industrial production could restore the numbers lost at Pearl Harbor, making the cost of Pacific recovery prohibitive enough to force a negotiated settlement. This was a coherent strategic sequence, and Midway was a credible way to implement it. What made it dangerous was not the logic, but the confidence. The planning process for Midway was, by the accounts of participants and subsequent historians, insufficiently rigorous in stress testing its own assumptions. War games conducted in advance of the operation were adjusted when they produced unfavorable results for the Japanese side, results that, in retrospect, bore a striking resemblance to what actually happened on the 4th of June. The institutional culture of the Japanese naval staff did not encourage the kind of frank, adversarial analysis that surfaces fatal flaws before the flaws are encountered in combat. The Coral Sea experience fed into this confidence in ways that were both accurate and misleading. The Japanese assessment of the Coral Sea was, on the surface battle result, not unreasonable. They had sunk an American fleet carrier and damaged another, while losing only a light carrier. The tactical damage to Shōkaku was serious, but it was temporary. She was not sunk, and she would be repaired. The air group losses on both Shōkaku and Zuikaku were significant, but the assessment was that they could be made good in time. What the Japanese assessment did not adequately credit was the quality of the American attack, the fact that American carrier aviation had coordinated a strike across 2 carriers and delivered it with enough precision and weight to put a Pearl Harbor veteran out of action. That was a data point about American capability that deserved more weight than it received. Instead, the dominant conclusion drawn from the Coral Sea was that Japanese carrier forces were superior to American ones, a conclusion that was true in some respects, but dangerously incomplete as a basis for planning the next operation. The experience of the Coral Sea air groups, the pilots and crews of Shōkaku and Zuikaku who had fought the battle, fed a more nuanced assessment into the system. If anyone had been listening to it closely enough, the American fighters had been more effective than expected. The American dive bombing had been accurate and aggressive. The American task force had maintained its discipline under attack and had not broken off its own strikes to conduct purely defensive operations. These were not the characteristics of a navy that was about to collapse under a sustained offensive. They were the characteristics of a navy that was learning, adapting, and fighting back imperfectly, with equipment that was in many respects inferior to Japanese equivalents, but with a determination and a professional quality that should have demanded respect. The men in the cockpits over the Coral Sea had known this. The strategic planners in Tokyo had drawn different conclusions. Yamamoto himself harbored doubts about the Midway operation that he expressed in private and suppressed in public, because the institutional momentum of Japanese naval planning had built around the operation to the point where questioning it had become professionally and culturally difficult. He understood, better than most of his contemporaries, the fragility of Japan's strategic position. He understood that the window of Japanese advantage was narrowing, but understanding the problem and having the institutional authority to change course are different things, and the culture of the Japanese naval staff in the spring of 1942 did not easily accommodate the kind of strategic revision that Yamamoto's private doubts might have produced. The Midway operation proceeded on its planned timeline, with the planned forces toward the planned objective and without Shōkaku and Zuikaku, whose absence was the Coral Sea's permanent imprint on the battle to come. The Japanese carriers and their escorts departed their home waters in the last days of May 1942, moving east toward Midway in the largest naval force Japan had yet assembled. Yamamoto's battleship force was at sea. The invasion transports with their troops were at sea. The carrier striking force, 4 fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, the same commander who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was at sea. The forces were divided across a wide front, a disposition that reflected the complexity of the operation's objectives, but that also meant that no single element of the force could quickly reinforce another if something went wrong. The fleet was powerful but dispersed. The plan was sophisticated but brittle, dependent on the Americans not knowing what was coming, on the element of surprise that the Japanese believed they possessed and that they had, in fact, already lost. The American carriers were waiting at Point Luck, northeast of Midway, in a position the Japanese search patterns had not been designed to cover. Yorktown, patched and imperfect and fully operational, was there alongside Enterprise and Hornet. The intelligence that had placed her there, the code breaking that had given Nimitz the time, the target, and the coordinates was the invisible weapon that no Japanese operational planner had factored into their calculations. The Battle of Midway was about to begin. And when it did, the work done in the Coral Sea, the damage to Shōkaku, the attrition of the Japanese air groups, the lessons embedded in Yorktown's repair would be present in the outcome, as surely as if the Coral Sea veterans had sailed to Midway themselves. History makes its connections quietly, through chains of consequence that are invisible at the time of making and clear only in retrospect. The Coral Sea and Midway were not separate battles. They were 2 acts of the same story, and the story was about to reach its climax. Chapter 15. Midway, the Coral Sea's children fight the decisive battle. The 4th of June, 1942, began before dawn with Japanese aircraft already in the air, heading for Midway Island to deliver the attack that would force the American carriers out of their hiding place and into the decisive engagement that Yamamoto had spent months engineering. The Japanese carrier striking force Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 of the finest fleet carriers in the world, was positioned northwest of Midway, launching with the confident precision that months of unbroken success had built into every procedure and every calculation. The pilots climbing into the pre-dawn sky were experienced, well-trained, and certain of their superiority. Their carriers were powerful, their air groups at full strength, their commander in tactical control of a force that had not yet met a challenge it could not overcome. On the surface of the 4th of June, everything about the Japanese position looked strong. Beneath that surface, everything that the Coral Sea had done was waiting. The absence of Shōkaku and Zuikaku was not abstract. It was visible in the aircraft count, in the number of strike aircraft and fighters available to the 4 carriers that were present. 2 additional fleet carriers would have added perhaps 150 aircraft to the Japanese striking force. That was not a marginal difference. In carrier warfare, where everything depends on the number and quality of aircraft you can put in the air at the right moment, 150 additional aircraft is the difference between a force that can sustain multiple strikes while maintaining adequate fighter cover and a force that is stretched thin by the demands of both offense and defense. Nagumo's force at Midway was powerful. With Shōkaku and Zuikaku, it would have been potentially overwhelming. Their absence purchased at the Coral Sea left a gap that the battle's outcome would eventually find and exploit. The morning developed in a direction that Japanese planning had not anticipated. American search aircraft, operating from Midway, found the Japanese carrier force before Japanese search aircraft found the American carriers. The timing of that contact earlier than the Japanese had planned for, revealing their position before they had located the Americans, began the process of disassembling the tactical assumptions that the Japanese plan depended on. Midway-based aircraft attacked the Japanese carriers in a series of strikes that failed to inflict serious damage but that forced Nagumo into a sequence of decisions about rearming his aircraft, switching from land attack ordnance to armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for an anti-ship mission that created the specific conditions of confusion and vulnerability that American carrier aircraft would find when they arrived over the Japanese fleet. The American carrier strikes from Enterprise and Hornet began to reach the Japanese force in mid-morning, and the first waves, the TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, were, by every measurable standard, catastrophically unsuccessful. They flew their slow, low attack runs through a wall of Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire and were destroyed in numbers that were agonizing to witness and impossible to ignore. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost every aircraft in its attack. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14. The torpedoes that were launched, those launched by crews who survived long enough to release them, achieved essentially nothing. The Japanese carriers maneuvered out of their tracks. The weapons ran deep or failed to detonate. It was the worst of the torpedo problem made manifest in the most consequential battle of the Pacific War, and it looked, in the moment, like a defeat. But the torpedo bombers had done something that was not visible in the accounting of their losses. They had pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters defending the carriers down to low altitude, where they were perfectly positioned to intercept torpedo aircraft and perfectly positioned to miss the dive bombers that were arriving at high altitude from a completely different vector. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, the SBD Dauntlesses, the same aircraft type that had put bombs on Shōkaku in the Coral Sea, arrived over the Japanese carriers at a moment when the defensive fighter cover was almost entirely occupied at low altitude, and the carrier decks below them were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft caught in the middle of a rearming cycle. The attack angle, the timing, the configuration of the targets, everything combined in a way that no planning document had predicted, and that the Japanese, despite all their preparations, had no answer for. In the space of roughly 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed from operational ships into burning wrecks. The dive bombers came down their steep attack angles and released at the right altitude, and the bombs found the most vulnerable targets imaginable. Flight decks crowded with fueled, armed aircraft, their ordnance loaded and ready, surrounded by the fuel and machinery of a working carrier at the peak of its operational tempo. The resulting fires and explosions were beyond the capacity of any damage control team to manage. The 3 carriers burned through the day and sank before evening. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, survived the morning attack and launched a counterstrike that found Yorktown and hit her with bombs and later with torpedoes. The ghost ship sequence that would become one of the most celebrated episodes of the battle, in which Japanese pilots attacked Yorktown twice, believing the second time they were hitting a fresh, undamaged carrier, because Yorktown's damage control teams had put out the fires from the first attack with the revolutionary speed that the Coral Sea's lessons had made possible. Yorktown's survival through the first Japanese counterstrike and her apparent resurrection as what the Japanese pilots believed was a different, undamaged carrier bought time for Enterprise's dive bombers to find Hiryu and strike her in the afternoon. Hiryu burned and sank the following morning. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers were gone. The Battle of Midway was, in its essential outcome, complete before the day was over. The Japanese fleet continued in the area for another day, Yamamoto briefly attempting to salvage some result from the catastrophe before withdrawing westward. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The turning point of the Pacific War had been reached, and it had been reached by a combination of intelligence, positioning, professionalism, and the specific accumulated advantages that the Coral Sea had contributed: the absence of 2 Japanese carriers, the presence of a repaired Yorktown, the damage control doctrine that had kept Yorktown fighting through the first counterstrike. Yorktown herself did not survive Midway. After the battle, as she was under tow toward Pearl Harbor for the full repairs she had never received, a Japanese submarine found her and hit her with torpedoes. She sank on the 7th of June, 1942, settling to the ocean floor roughly 3 miles down in the Pacific. She had done everything asked of her, and more. She had been at the Coral Sea and at Midway. She had survived damage that should have sent her to the bottom. She had been the ship that Japanese pilots attacked twice, thinking she was two different carriers, and she had stayed in the fight through both attacks. When she finally went down, she had earned every word that would later be written about her. The Navy gave her name to the next carrier off the ways and to others after that because some names are too important to retire. The connection between the Coral Sea and Midway is not a footnote. It is not a minor historical qualification added at the end of the Midway story to give context. It is central. The Coral Sea was the battle that shaped the conditions of Midway. It removed two Japanese carriers from the decisive engagement. It provided the Yorktown with the operational experience and the institutional resolve to perform the extraordinary repair that put her at Midway. It generated the damage control lessons that kept her fighting through two attacks. It demonstrated, to American carrier aviation, that the doctrine and the training were adequate, imperfect, costly, requiring revision, but adequate for the fight they were in. All of that flowed from 5 days in May of 1942, from the decisions made by Fletcher and Fitch and Sherman and their crews, from the sacrifice of Lady Lex and her 200 men, from the first carrier battle in the history of naval warfare. The Coral Sea did not win the Battle of Midway, but Midway could not have been won, as it was without what the Coral Sea had done. The Pacific War would continue for more than 3 years after Midway. There would be more battles, more carriers lost, more men killed, more islands taken and defended and taken again. The Coral Sea was one battle in a very long war, but it was the battle that proved the concept that American carrier aviation could fight, could learn, and could prevail against an enemy that had every reason to believe itself superior. That proof was not incidental, it was foundational. Everything that came after was built on it. Chapter 16. The men behind the machines, crew, community, and the human cost. The history of great naval battles tends to resolve, in the telling, into a sequence of tactical decisions and strategic consequences, admirals on bridges, aircraft on flight decks, ships maneuvering through the narrative choreography of engagement. What gets compressed in this telling, or sometimes lost entirely, is the texture of individual human experience, the specific, unrepeatable lives of the men who were there, who did the work, who paid the cost. The Battle of the Coral Sea was fought by admirals and by carrier captains, yes, but it was also fought by boiler technicians and cooks and ordnancemen and radiomen, and the thousands of men who kept the ships operational, kept the aircraft fueled and armed, kept the damage control parties organized and functional. Their story is not separate from the battle's story, it is the battle's story, seen from a different level. The men who served on Lexington and Yorktown in the spring of 1942 came from every part of the United States. The Navy of 1942 was a very different institution from the Navy of today in almost every social and structural respect. But in one respect, it was recognizable. It was made up of men who came from everywhere, from the industrial cities of the Northeast and the Midwest, from the farms of the South and the plains, from the coastal towns of the Pacific Northwest and the fishing communities of New England. They were young. The average age of a carrier's enlisted complement was well under 25. Many of them had joined the Navy before Pearl Harbor, attracted by the pay or the adventure or the training in skills that had no civilian equivalent. Others had enlisted in the weeks and months after Pearl Harbor, motivated by that specific combination of anger and obligation that a direct attack on your country produces. They were not one thing. They were thousands of things, compressed into the crew of a ship and shaped, over months of service, into something that functioned as a coherent whole. Life on a fleet carrier in 1942 was not comfortable, but it was not the unrelieved grimness that popular imagination sometimes assigns to wartime naval service. The ships were large enough to have their own social geography areas of the ship that belonged to different groups, hierarchies of rank that were genuine and enforced, but also the informal bonds of men who worked and ate and slept in close proximity and who learned, over time, each other's specific competence and specific character in the way that only sustained close quarters can produce. The ready rooms where pilots gathered between missions were centers of a particular kind of fellowship, competitive, intensely professional, dark-humored in the way that men are dark-humored when they are regularly in danger. The engine rooms were a different kind of community, defined by the noise and heat of the machinery and by the skills of the men who kept it running. The hangar bays were another community, still mechanical, precise, organized around the rhythms of maintaining complex flying machines in conditions that ranged from routine to chaotic. The Tulagi and Shoho strikes of the 7th of May produced, among the aircrew of both carriers, a specific kind of professional confidence. They had done the thing they had been trained to do. The aircraft had launched, formed up, navigated to the target, delivered their weapons, and returned. The damage control teams, the flight deck crews, the maintenance personnel had all performed under operational conditions. The confidence this produced was not arrogance, not after 5 months of watching the Japanese advance relentlessly across the Pacific. It was something quieter and more durable, the knowledge that you can do the job. That knowledge matters in warfare in a way that is difficult to quantify but easy to recognize. Men who know they can do the job function differently in a crisis than men who are uncertain. They make better decisions under pressure. They improvise more effectively when the plan fails. They sustain their effort further into exhaustion and fear. The 8th of May tested that confidence with everything it had. The men in the damage control parties on Lexington, who fought the fires from the Japanese attack, and then fought the far more dangerous fires from the gasoline vapor explosions, were not doing something that training had fully prepared them for. No peacetime exercise had simulated the specific horror of cascading explosions in the lower decks of a burning carrier. They were doing it on the basis of the principles that training had given them: isolate the fire, cut off its fuel, protect the men around it, communicate up the chain applied with whatever improvisation the specific conditions required. Some of them were killed doing it. Others kept going until the order came to abandon ship. The order, when it came, was obeyed with the discipline that good leadership produces, not because the men were incapable of panic, but because the captain they trusted had told them it was time, and they trusted him. The abandon ship procedure on Lexington was, by any standard, extraordinarily well executed. Captain Sherman and his executive officer were the last men off the ship, a fact that the crew knew and that mattered to them, not in an abstract symbolic sense, but in the immediate, practical sense that a commanding officer who stays until the last man is off has demonstrated with the clearest possible evidence that his priorities are exactly what he had always claimed them to be. The rescue by the escort ships was conducted with equal professionalism, the cruisers and destroyers moving close alongside the burning carrier, their crews working to recover men from the water with the specific skills and equipment that this kind of rescue requires. The temperature of the water helped. The calm sea state helped. The proximity of the escort ships helped. But all of those factors would have been less effective without the organization and discipline of the men doing the rescuing and the men being rescued. The survivors were distributed across the fleet. Many of them were back at sea within weeks, some of them at Midway, serving on Enterprise or Hornet or on the destroyers that escorted the carriers. They carried with them a specific and irreplaceable form of knowledge. The knowledge of what a carrier looks like when it is burning from inside, when the explosions are working their way through the lower decks, when the order comes to abandon. That knowledge was not pleasant to carry. It was not the kind of knowledge that improves a man's sleep or lightens his day. But it was knowledge that the Navy needed, and the men who had it shared it in their subsequent service, in the informal instruction they provided to less experienced shipmates, in the formal after-action review process that the Navy used to extract lessons from every significant engagement. Lady Lex was gone, but her crew's experience was not gone with her. The families waiting at home in the towns and cities and farms that the carrier crews had come from experienced the Coral Sea at a long remove through the imperfect and often delayed communications that wartime censorship and logistics produced. The notification of casualties reached families through the formal channels of the Navy's casualty notification system, which was, by the standards of the time, relatively efficient, but still capable of producing the specific anguish of receiving a notification weeks after the event it described. The letters home, the ones written before the battle, held in postal queues, delivered after the writer was already gone, were a particular kind of grief, intimate and specific and impossible to prepare for. For the families of the more than 200 men lost with Lexington, the 8th of May was not a date in a history book. It was the day the world changed. For the veterans who survived, who came home at the end of the war and tried to reassemble their civilian lives around what they had done, and seen the Coral Sea was a specific weight carried in specific ways. Some of them talked about it, many of them did not. The culture of the Second World War generation was not one that encouraged extensive verbal processing of combat experience. The expectation was that you came home, you got on with it, you built the life that the men who had not come home could not build. That expectation was not without its own cost. It produced silences in families, distances in marriages, losses that accumulated over years without ever being fully named. But it also produced, in many of those men, a particular and profound appreciation for the ordinary weight of daily life, for the fact of being alive in a world where being alive was not guaranteed, that the people who had not been through what they had been through, sometimes found difficult to understand and sometimes found quietly humbling. Their story is part of the Coral Sea. Not a footnote to it, not a supplement, but part of it. Every battle is finally a human story, the story of specific people in specific circumstances, making specific choices. The Coral Sea's tactics and strategy were important. Its consequences were enormous. But the men who fought it were what made it real. Chapter 17. The Long Reckoning, How the Coral Sea Shaped Everything After. The Battle of the Coral Sea was not, in the standard periodizations of Pacific War history, the event that changed the tide. That designation belongs to Midway, but the tide does not change at a single point on the ocean. It turns across a wide front, in the complex interaction of currents and depths and the shape of the sea floor, in processes that are gradual and then sudden, incremental, and then decisive. The Coral Sea was where the turning began, not visibly, not with the clarity that Midway would eventually provide, but actually and consequentially in ways that shaped everything that followed. Its effects moved forward through the war in the careers of the men who fought it, in the design changes of the ships that came after it, in the doctrine revisions that it forced, and the strategic calculations that it altered. The carrier program that the United States Navy launched in the wake of Pearl Harbor was already underway before the Coral Sea was fought. The hulls of the Essex-class carriers, the 27,000-ton fleet carriers that would be the backbone of the American carrier force from 1943 onward, had been laid down in the industrial build-up of the early war period. But the Coral Sea's lessons shaped what those ships looked like when they were completed, and how they were operated when they entered service. The fuel vapor problem, the gasoline explosion cascade that had killed Lexington, was engineered into the design of every subsequent American carrier. Vapor-proof fuel systems, carbon dioxide purging arrangements, improved ventilation design, revised damage control procedures, all of these were direct responses to what had happened on the 8th of May. Every Essex-class carrier that survived the war carried, embedded in its engineering, the knowledge purchased by Lexington's loss. The fighter direction system, the radar-controlled interception doctrine that the Coral Sea had tested under combat conditions and found partially adequate, was comprehensively revised in the months after the battle. The problems had been clear. The radar coverage was uneven, the communication between the fighter direction officer and the airborne combat air patrol was insufficiently coordinated. The vector instructions were sometimes too slow to position fighters for effective interception before attacking aircraft had already penetrated to weapons release range. These problems were not simple to fix, but they were identifiable, and the Navy attacked them with the institutional energy of an organization that understood precisely what it had seen in the Coral Sea. Improved radar systems, dedicated fighter direction officers with more authority and better communications equipment, revised interception procedures, all of it was in the pipeline within months. By the time of the great carrier battles of 1944, American fighter direction had become one of the most effective tactical systems in any navy in the world. The aircraft issue the inferiority of the Wildcat to the Zero. The inadequacy of the TBD Devastator as a torpedo attack platform was addressed in parallel with the doctrine revisions. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which would replace the Wildcat as the primary carrier fighter, was already in development at the time of the Coral Sea. The battle added urgency to its production. The Hellcat would prove decisively superior to the Zero in the conditions of the 1943 and 44 battles, faster, better armed, more durable, and flown by crews who had studied the Coral Sea and Midway experience with the specific purpose of understanding what Japanese tactics looked like and how to counter them. The Grumman TBF Avenger, which replaced the TBD Devastator, was a completely different aircraft. Larger, faster, longer-ranged, capable of carrying a heavier torpedo and delivering it from a more survivable attack profile. The Devastators that had been cut down over Midway were the last generation of their kind. The Avenger that replaced them carried the lessons of their sacrifice into every subsequent operation. The torpedo problem itself required more time to solve than the aircraft problem. American torpedoes in the first 2 years of the war were plagued by a catalogue of failures: depth-keeping failures, contact exploder failures, magnetic exploder failures that reduced their effectiveness dramatically below what their specifications suggested. The problem was partly mechanical, partly doctrinal, and partly the product of a pre-war testing program that had been conducted under conditions insufficiently close to real combat. Fixing it required years of engineering work, operational feedback, and institutional willingness to acknowledge that the weapon was not performing as advertised, an acknowledgement that the Navy's torpedo development bureaucracy resisted for longer than it should have. But the Coral Sea and Midway and the submarine operations that produced the same evidence in a different theatre made the evidence undeniable. The torpedo program was eventually reformed, the exploder mechanisms redesigned and tested properly, and by the middle years of the war, American air-launched and submarine-launched torpedoes were performing with the reliability that the tactical plans had always assumed they possessed. The intelligence system that had made both the Coral Sea and Midway possible, the code-breaking operation at Pearl Harbor and its supporting network, was itself a consequence of investments and decisions made before the Parter War, but the Coral Sea validated it in ways that secured its resources and its institutional priority for the rest of the war. An intelligence system that predicted a Japanese carrier operation in the Coral Sea correctly enough to allow 2 American carriers to intercept it, and that then predicted the Midway operation with sufficient accuracy to allow Nimitz to position his carriers for a devastating surprise, was an intelligence system of demonstrated strategic value. The funding, the personnel, the institutional protection that the Signals Intelligence Program received in the years after Coral Sea and Midway were a direct investment in maintaining the advantage that those battles had shown it could provide. That advantage, the ability to know, with reasonable accuracy, where the enemy was and what he intended, would prove one of the most consistent American advantages for the remainder of the Pacific War. The Australian alliance that the Coral Sea had been fought partly to protect was itself transformed by the battle's outcome. The cooperative relationship between the United States Navy and the Royal Australian Navy, and between American and Australian forces more broadly, was deepened by the experience of fighting alongside each other in the Coral Sea and in the New Guinea campaign that followed. The geography of the Pacific War meant that Australia was, for much of the conflict, the primary base for American operations in the Southwest Pacific area, and the logistics, the basing rights, the cooperation between forces that this required was built on a foundation of shared experience that the Coral Sea had contributed to laying. The alliance did not begin at the Coral Sea, but it was cemented there in a way that subsequent history recognized. The annual Battle of the Coral Sea commemorations, maintained by both navies for decades after the war ended, were not merely ceremonial. They were acknowledgements of a specific debt and a specific bond. The veterans of the Coral Sea dispersed through the American naval establishment after the battle, carrying their experience to every subsequent engagement. Men who had served on Lexington, who had learned on that ship's flight deck what carrier operations actually looked like under combat conditions, went to the new carriers as they commissioned, bringing the institutional knowledge that made those ships effective faster than they could have been without it. Men who had flown over the Coral Sea, who had pressed their dives through anti-aircraft fire and released their bombs at the right altitude and watched the results, became the instructors and flight leaders of the next generation of carrier aviators. The experience accumulated at the Coral Sea was not lost when the ships that carried it were damaged or sunk. It was redistributed, multiplied, and applied exactly as the experience of any institution is redistributed and applied when the people who hold it go on to new positions and new challenges. The transformation of the American carrier force between the Coral Sea and the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, less than 2 years, was among the most rapid and comprehensive evolutions in military capability in the history of warfare. The force that fought the Philippine Sea had 15 fleet and light carriers. It had air groups flying aircraft that were, in several important respects, a generation beyond anything that had fought over the Coral Sea. It had fighter direction systems and damage control procedures and logistics support structures that bore the imprint of everything the Coral Sea and the battles that followed it had taught. The Japanese carrier force that it faced in the Philippine Sea, the last major Japanese carrier offensive of the war, was destroyed with a completeness that ended Japanese carrier aviation as a significant offensive factor. The disproportion of the outcome reflected the magnitude of the difference between the two forces' rates of learning and adaptation in the 2 years since the Coral Sea. The Coral Sea had started a process. That process ran forward through the war, through every revision and improvement and new design and new doctrine, all the way to the ending of the Pacific War in August of 1945. It ran forward through the careers of the men who fought it, through the design specifications of the ships that followed it, through the alliance relationships it helped to forge, through the institutional knowledge it deposited in the body of the American Navy. It was, in the most literal sense, consequential, full of consequences, generating them in every direction, shaping the future with the specific, indelible force of things that actually happened. The Coral Sea was 5 days and 200 men and 1 fleet carrier. It was also the beginning of everything that came after. Chapter 18. The Sea remembers final reflections on America's first strike. There is a place in the Coral Sea, roughly 500 miles off the eastern coast of Australia, where the ocean floor holds the wreck of USS Lexington. She has been there since the evening of the 8th of May, 1942, more than 80 years now, resting in the darkness at a depth of nearly 2 miles, preserved by the cold and pressure in a state of remarkable integrity. Her aircraft are still in the hangar. Her equipment is still in place. The name on her hull, the name that her crew painted and polished and maintained through 14 years of service, is still readable in the deep-sea images that the research vessel RV Petrel brought back on the 4th of March 2018, when the wreck was finally found. The ocean has kept her, in its way. She has not been forgotten. She was simply waiting to be found. The finding of Lexington, after more than 7 decades of uncertainty about her exact location, produced a response that revealed something important about the hold that the Coral Sea still has on the people connected to it. Veterans who had served on her, men in their 90s, men who had gone into the warm water on the evening of the 8th of May, 1942, and been pulled aboard destroyers and cruisers by hands they had never met before, watched the deep-sea images with an attention that was not curiosity, but recognition. They knew those spaces. They had lived in them. The machinery and the fixtures and the specific geography of a ship that was now a wreck 2 miles beneath the Pacific were the machinery and fixtures and geography of their young manhood. For the families of the more than 200 men who had not come out of the water, the images had a different weight, a location, finally, for a loss that had for decades existed only as a date and an official notification. The ocean had given back something that it had held for 76 years. The preservation and commemoration of the Coral Sea battle is complicated by a fact that any honest telling of history must acknowledge. It is not the most famous battle of the Pacific War. Midway has the movies, the books, the popular recognition. The Coral Sea, which preceded Midway and shaped its conditions, is known to naval historians and to people with a deep interest in the Second World War, but it has not entered popular culture with the same force. This disproportion is understandable. Midway had a cleaner outcome, a more dramatic arc, a more satisfying narrative shape, but it is, in a historical sense, slightly unjust. The Coral Sea was harder to win. It cost more. Its outcome was more ambiguous. And its consequences, the ones that run forward to Midway and beyond, were arguably more important than the battle's immediate tactical result would suggest. The men who fought the Coral Sea deserve a place in the telling of the Pacific War's history that is proportionate to what they actually did and what their doing actually cost. The pilots of Lexington and Yorktown who flew against Shōho and Shōkaku flew into a kind of warfare that had never happened before, without the benefit of anyone who had done it successfully to tell them how. The damage control crews who fought the fires on Lexington who managed, through 2 hours of effort, to bring a torpedoed and bombed carrier back to apparent operational capability before the gasoline vapors took that achievement away from them, were doing their job in conditions that no exercise had fully prepared them for, with a professionalism that the outcome should not be allowed to obscure. The sailors who went over the side in good order, at the command of a captain who stayed until last, who entered the water with the discipline of men who had been well led and well trained, were performing, in one of the most extreme circumstances a sailor can face, exactly as their navy had prepared them to perform. The significance of the Coral Sea as the first carrier battle in history has been noted frequently, but perhaps not fully appreciated. When historians say it was the first naval engagement in which opposing surface fleets never came within sight of each other, they are describing more than a curiosity. They are describing a revolution, the arrival of a form of warfare in which the geographic range of lethal force had been extended so far beyond what any previous naval technology had achieved that the entire conceptual framework of naval combat had to be rebuilt around it. Ships had fought each other across visible horizons for as long as there had been ships. The Coral Sea ended that era not officially, not with a declaration, but factually. The ships that met in the Coral Sea never saw each other. The battle was conducted entirely through the medium of aviation, at ranges that would have seemed impossible to a naval officer of the previous generation. The age of the carrier had arrived, and its arrival changed everything about how naval power was exercised, how naval doctrine was written, how naval forces were structured and trained and deployed. That revolution continued after the Coral Sea, carried forward by every subsequent engagement in the Pacific War. The aircraft carriers that sailed in the later years of the conflict, the Essex-class ships, the fast carrier task forces of 1944 and 45, operated under doctrines and with capabilities that the Coral Sea's experience had helped to build. Their commanders were men who had studied the Coral Sea, who had drawn lessons from its failures as well as its achievements, who had applied those lessons to the training and equipping and organization of the forces they led. The lineage runs forward clearly and directly, from the Coral Sea to Midway, from Midway to the Philippine Sea, from the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf, and finally to the overwhelming air and sea power that the United States Navy deployed in the last year of the Pacific War. Every step of that progression was informed, in part, by what had happened in the Coral Sea in May of 1942. The Coral Sea is also, in a quiet and important sense, an Australian story. The battle was fought partly on Australia's behalf, in waters that Australians knew and that Australian ships and aircraft had participated in defending. The Port Moresby that the invasion force had been turned away from in May of 1942 to remained a contested objective. For more than a year afterward, the Japanese would attempt to reach it overland, across the Owen Stanley Mountains, in one of the most brutal infantry campaigns of the Pacific War. That overland campaign would also fail, at enormous cost to the Australian and Japanese soldiers who fought it. But the seaborne approach had been closed at the Coral Sea, and the closure mattered. Every Australian who has thought carefully about the Pacific War has understood, at some level, that the Coral Sea was a battle fought partly for them by American carriers and Australian cruisers, by men who were there because their country's fates were intertwined in a way that the geography of the Pacific and the ambition of the Japanese Empire had made inescapable. The wrecks of Lexington and Yorktown are, in the formal legal sense, United States Navy vessels protected military grave sites, sovereign territory of the United States government, not to be disturbed or salvaged. They are also, in a larger and less legalistic sense, monuments to a particular moment in history, the moment when the United States Navy, stripped of its battleships by the attack on Pearl Harbor, discovered that it possessed in its carrier force a weapon of extraordinary power and flexibility, and learned, at considerable cost and under the most demanding conditions imaginable, how to use that weapon effectively. The men who are entombed in those wrecks, the more than 200 who went down with Lexington, the 66 who died on Yorktown in the Coral Sea, are part of that monument. They are not statistics or data points. They are the specific human cost of the specific achievement. History is always being made by people who do not know they are making history. The sailors and pilots and officers who fought the Coral Sea were doing their job, the job they had trained for, the job the Navy had sent them to do, the job that the strategic situation of May 1942 required. They were not thinking about legacy or lineage or the chain of consequence that would run from their engagement to Midway and beyond. They were thinking about fuel states and search sectors and fire control and the specific, immediate, overwhelming demands of a battle that was happening right now, to them, in the warm waters of the sea that would bear its name. The history they were making was invisible to them in the moment of making it. It became visible only later in the outcome at Midway, in the design of the ships that followed, in the doctrine of the Navy that came after, in the wreck on the ocean floor that waited 76 years to be found. Lady Lex is down there still. The Coral Sea lies above her, warm and blue, as it was on the morning of the 7th of May, 1942, when her aircraft launched toward a target they had never attacked before. The water is quiet at 2 miles depth. The pressure is absolute. Nothing moves except the slow drift of the deep currents and the creatures of the deep sea that have made the wreck their home. She is gone. But she is not forgotten. As long as the story is told, and it will keep being told, because it is too important and too human to stop being told. Lady Lex and the men who served on her are present in it. The Coral Sea was America's first carrier strike. It cost what it cost, and it mattered more than anyone could have known in the moment it was fought. That is the complete history of the Coral Sea carriers, 18 chapters, more than 80 years of distance, and a debt to the men who fought there that no documentary can fully pay, but that every telling of the story makes a small payment toward. Thank you for watching and for staying the whole long way through. If this documentary gave you something, a name, a fact, a face put to a story you had only half heard before, please leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel. The next documentary is already in production. The Pacific War has many more stories to tell, and we intend to tell every one of them. Sleep well tonight.